Hello everyone and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Vincent Moreland, and I've been a park ranger in West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest for 13 years. In all that time, I figured I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at a man. 3 missing hunters in October of 1973 proved me dead wrong. I never put much stock in the old mountain stories. You know the ones. Tales about the Fook monster, wild men living deep in the hollows, things that go bump in the night. Always figured folks were just seeing black bears standing upright, maybe getting spooked by shadows and letting their minds run wild. Hell, I'd rescued 47 people from backcountry emergencies, and the scariest thing I ever encountered was a mama bear with cubs. My wife Sarah used to tease me about being too practical. "Vince," she'd say while grading papers at our kitchen table, "sometimes I think you wouldn't believe in ghosts even if one walked right through that door." Our 2 boys, Tommy and Jake, they loved the spooky stories their classmates would tell around campfires. But me? I was all business. The morning of October 15th started normal enough. I was sitting in my office at the ranger station, working through paperwork and sipping coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The radio crackled to life around 9:30. "Base, this is search and rescue dispatch. We've got 3 hunters overdue from the Devil's Backbone Ridge area, Pennsylvania plates, bow hunters, supposed to check in yesterday morning." Devil's Backbone Ridge. Even the name should have warned me. It's one of the most remote sections of the forest, a maze of deep hollows and limestone caves about 45 miles from the nearest town. The Cherokee used to call something in that area Kekle Kudla. I never did learn what it meant, but the way the old-timers said it always made me uncomfortable. I grabbed my gear and headed out in the truck. The October air was crisp, maybe 35 degrees, and an unseasonable fog was rolling through the valleys. Radio contact gets spotty out there even on good days. All those deep hollows and rock formations play hell with signals. Jake Patterson met me at the trailhead. Jake's been working these mountains even longer than me, a grizzled old ranger who knows every deer path and rock formation for 50 miles. He brought his tracking dog, Ranger, a bloodhound mix that could follow a week-old trail through a thunderstorm. "What do you think happened to them?" I asked as we loaded our packs. Jake spat tobacco juice and shook his head. "Probably moved camp due to weather and forgot to radio in. City boys don't always follow protocol." Made sense. We'd dealt with similar situations before. Hunters getting turned around, setting up camp in a different spot than planned, losing track of time during hunting season. Standard search and rescue stuff. The hike to their last known location took 3 hours through thick rhododendron and old-growth hemlock. The fog seemed to follow us, clinging to the trees in ways that felt wrong somehow. About halfway there, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely quiet. No bird songs, no squirrels chattering, not even insects buzzing. Just our boots crunching on dead leaves and the sound of our breathing. "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked Jake. He nodded, frowning. Animals sometimes go quiet before a storm. But there was no storm coming. The weather report called for clear skies. We found their campsite just before noon, and right away I knew something was very wrong. The hunters' camp was exactly where it should be, tucked into a small clearing beside a creek. Their tents were still up. sleeping bags neatly arranged inside. The fire ring had cold ashes, but when I knelt down and put my hand near the coals, I could still feel warmth. That fire was burning this morning, I told Jake, maybe even a few hours ago. But the hunters had been missing for 2 days. Jake was examining their gear. "Look at this, Vince." He pointed to their food supplies, still sealed in waterproof containers. The food hadn't been touched, but someone had arranged it in strange geometric patterns around the fire ring. Canned beans formed a perfect triangle. Crackers boxes made a square. The coffee can sat alone in the center. "What kind of person arranges their food like that?" Jake muttered. The really weird part was the hunting bows. All 3 were hanging 15 feet up in the trees, tied with their own bowstrings. No way a man could reach that high, even standing on something. I pulled out my radio to call in our findings. Static filled the channel, mixed with a low humming sound I'd never heard before. "Base, this is Moreland. We've found the camp, but..." The humming got louder, making my teeth ache. "Base, do you copy?" Nothing but static and that awful humming. Jake was studying the ground around the camp with Ranger, looking for tracks. The dog had been acting strange since we arrived, whimpering, staying close to Jake's legs, refusing to put his nose to the ground like he usually did. "Dog's spooked," Jake said. "Never seen him like this." That's when I found the first track. It was in the soft mud beside the creek, clear as day. At first glance, it looked almost human, but bigger, much bigger. The print was nearly 18 inches long, with what looked like toes. But there were 6 of them, not 5, and they ended in what had to be claws. "Jake, come look at this." He knelt beside me, studying the print. Ranger took one sniff and backed away, hackles raised, a low whine coming from his throat. "That's not a bear print," Jake said quietly. "Bears got 5 toes, and they don't look like that." "What else could make a track like that?" Jake stood up, scanning the tree line. "I don't know, but whatever it was, it's big. Look at how deep that print sunk into the mud." We followed the tracks away from the camp. They led toward a cluster of limestone caves about half a mile deeper into the hollow. The stride was enormous. Whoever or whatever made these tracks was covering nearly 18 inches with each step. As we got closer to the caves, I started noticing other things. Trees that had been snapped off about 12 feet up, broken clean in half like giant matchsticks. Long scratches gouged deep into rock faces, too high and too deep for any animal I knew about. My compass started acting up, the needle spinning wildly instead of pointing north. My flashlight dimmed even though I'd put in fresh batteries that morning. "We should call for backup," I said, but my radio still wasn't working. Near the entrance to the largest cave, we found something that made my blood run cold. Bones. Lots of them. Deer bones mostly, but arranged in careful patterns like the food back at camp. Rib bones formed circles. Leg bones pointed toward the cave entrance like arrows. And scattered among the deer bones were pieces of human clothing. A torn flannel shirt, a hunting boot with the laces cut, a baseball cap with the Pennsylvania Steelers logo. Jake picked up the boot with a stick. "Size 12, he said. "That matches the description of one of our missing hunters." Deep inside the cave, something howled. The sound didn't come from one direction. It seemed to echo from everywhere at once, bouncing off the rock walls and filling the hollow. It was deep and resonant, like nothing I'd ever heard. Not a wolf, not a bear, not any animal I could identify. The sound went right through me, making my bones vibrate and my stomach turn sick. Ranger bolted, just turned tail and ran back toward the trail, howling in terror. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his face pale. "Right now." But as we turned to leave, I saw them. Footprints in the cave entrance. The same six-toed tracks, but fresh, recent, leading out of the cave. Whatever had made those tracks was no longer inside. It was somewhere out here in the hollow with us. The hike back to the trailhead felt like the longest 3 hours of my life. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow between the trees looked like something watching us. The fog had gotten thicker, turning the forest into a gray maze where you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Jake kept looking over his shoulder. "You feel that?" he asked. "Feel what?" "Like we're being followed." I did feel it. That prickly sensation between your shoulder blades when someone's staring at you. But every time we turned around, nothing was there except fog and trees. When we finally reached the truck, I tried the radio again. This time I got through to dispatch, but the connection was full of static. "Base, this is Moreland. We found evidence of the missing hunters, but we're going to need more search teams, and maybe some state police." "Copy that, Moreland. What kind of evidence?" I looked at Jake, wondering how to explain what we'd found without sounding crazy. Personal belongings scattered around a cave system, signs of unusual activity. Unusual how? I'd rather explain in person. Just send backup. The dispatcher promised to have teams out by morning, but that meant spending the night in a motel in town. Neither Jake nor I wanted to camp anywhere near Devil's Backbone Ridge. At the Sleepy Inn, Jake and I sat in the diner attached to the motel, picking at our food and trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The coffee tasted like motor oil, but I kept drinking it anyway, hoping the caffeine would steady my nerves. 40 years I've been in these mountains," Jake said, staring out the window at the fog. "Never seen anything like those tracks." "Could be some kind of bear mutation," I suggested. "Sometimes animals are born with extra toes." 18-inch paw prints? And what about those trees snapped off 12 feet up? You ever see a bear do that? I hadn't. Bears can climb, but they don't snap trees in half, especially not that high off the ground. My phone rang, the motel room phone, since cell service was spotty out here. It was Sarah. "Vince, you sound tired." "Long day. How are the boys?" "That's actually why I'm calling. They came home from school with a story that has me worried. Some of their classmates were talking about strange noises coming from the mountains, howling that doesn't sound like any animal. Mrs. Henderson's boy swears he saw something tall and hairy watching their house from the tree line." I felt my stomach drop. When was this? Last night. And Vince. The Morrison family packed up and left town this afternoon. Didn't say where they were going, just loaded up their truck and drove off. The Morrisons had lived in these mountains for 4 generations. What could scare them enough to abandon their home? "I'll be home tomorrow," I promised. "Keep the boys inside after dark." That night, I barely slept. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear that howling sound echoing in my memory. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up and sat by the window, watching the fog roll through the parking lot. The next morning, Jake and I met up with the search teams, 6 more rangers, 2 state police officers, and a K-9 unit. The plan was to do a thorough grid search of the cave system and the surrounding area. But when we got back to the hunters' campsite, we found something that made everyone go quiet. The camp had been destroyed. Tents were shredded to pieces. Gear was scattered everywhere, some of it thrown high into the trees. The fire ring had been torn apart, stones hurled in all directions. And in the middle of the destruction, we found one of the hunting rifles. It had been torn in half, not broken, torn. The metal barrel was twisted like a pretzel, and the wooden stock was splintered into a dozen pieces. The bullets from the magazine were scattered on the ground, but none had been fired. State Police Sergeant Mills picked up a piece of the rifle stock. What kind of strength would it take to do this to a hunting rifle? Nobody answered, because none of us knew. The K-9 officer tried to get his dog to track from the campsite, but the German Shepherd reacted just like Ranger had, whimpering, backing away, refusing to follow any scent trail toward the caves. "Both dogs can't be wrong," Jake said quietly. We spread out in a search grid, working our way toward the limestone caves. I was paired with Ranger Tommy Chen, a young guy who'd transferred in from Virginia. About halfway to the caves, he grabbed my arm. "You hear that?" I stopped and listened, faint at first, but getting clearer. Voices calling from deeper in the hollow. Human voices, shouting for help. "That's got to be them," Chen said, pulling out his radio. "Base, we've got contact with possible survivors," following voices toward cave system. We hurried toward the sound, but as we got closer, something felt wrong about those voices. They were too clear, too loud, and they seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. "Help us!" The voice was definitely human, definitely male. "We're trapped in the cave. Please help." But when we reached the cave entrance, there was no one there. "Hello?" Chen called out. "Where are you?" "Down here," came the reply, seeming to echo from deep inside the cave. "We can't get out." Chen started toward the cave entrance, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said. "Something's not right." "We're hurt bad," came another voice. "Please, you have to help us." But I was listening more carefully now. The voices were perfect. Too perfect, like someone playing back a recording. And underneath them, I could hear something else. A low rumbling sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. That's when we saw the eyes. Deep in the cave, maybe 50 feet back, 2 yellow points of light were watching us. They were positioned about 12 feet off the ground, which was impossible unless someone was standing on a ladder. "Chen, back away from the cave." "Now." The eyes moved. Not like a person turning their head, but like something massive shifting its weight. And as they moved, I caught a glimpse of what was behind them. Something huge, something covered in dark fur, something that definitely wasn't human. The voices stopped calling for help. Instead, that deep, bone-rattling howl filled the hollow again. But this time, it was answered by howls from other directions. North of us, south, east. We weren't dealing with one creature. We were surrounded. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Chen by the shoulder and pulling him away from the cave. Behind us, something crashed through the cave entrance. I didn't look back, but I could hear it. Heavy footsteps that shook the ground, branches snapping, rocks tumbling. Whatever was chasing us was big enough to knock down trees. Chen was younger and faster, but I knew these mountains better. I led him off the main trail, zigzagging through thick rhododendron bushes and jumping over fallen logs. The howling continued from multiple directions, like a pack of wolves coordinating a hunt. My radio crackled to life. "All units, return to staging area immediately. Emergency extraction in progress." We reached a clearing where I could see the other search team members running through the forest below us. Sergeant Mills was helping one of the rangers who seemed to be limping badly. In the distance, I could see our vehicles. That's when the first creature stepped into the clearing. It was 12 feet tall, easily, covered in dark, matted fur that looked almost black in the fog. Its arms were too long for its body, hanging down past its knees, ending in hands with 6 fingers tipped with claws. The face was almost human, but wrong, the jaw too wide, the eyes too large and too yellow. When it opened its mouth, I could see teeth like a shark's. But the worst part was the intelligence in those eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast. It was thinking, planning, hunting. Mills drew his service weapon and fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets hit. I could see the impact, but the creature barely flinched. It looked down at its chest where the bullets had struck, then looked back at Mills and made a sound that might have been laughter. 2 more creatures emerged from the tree line on either side of the clearing. They moved with purpose, herding us away from the vehicles and toward another set of limestone caves. The caves, I realized out loud. They're trying to drive us into the caves. Chen was pale as a ghost, fumbling for his own weapon. What are those things? I remembered what Moses Blackfeather, the old Cherokee elder, had told me once about the mining operation that had started up a month ago. They'd been blasting in the deep cave systems, opening tunnels that had been sealed for who knew how long. They're what used to live down there, I said, before we woke them up. The creatures were closing in, moving with coordinated precision. One would advance while the others flanked, keeping us moving in the direction they wanted. They were hunting as a pack, using intelligence and strategy. We had no choice but to head toward the caves. The limestone cave system was bigger than I'd expected, a series of connected caverns that went deep into the mountain. Emergency flares from the other rangers cast dancing shadows on the walls, revealing carved symbols that definitely weren't made by any modern tool. "These drawings," one of the rangers said, shining his flashlight on the cave walls. "Some of them look old, really old." The symbols showed human figures, but also other shapes. Tall, long-armed figures with too many fingers, and scenes that looked like sacrifice. Humans being dragged into cave mouths by the tall figures. A rumbling sound echoed through the caves, followed by the scraping of stone on stone. The creatures were sealing us in, rolling boulders across the cave entrances like they were moving furniture. "There," Mills said, pointing his flashlight toward the back of the cave. "Water." An underground stream flowed through the deepest part of the cave system. The water was black and cold, but it had to go somewhere. Maybe to another entrance, another way out. The howling was getting closer. Whatever those things were, they were coming into the caves after us. "We have to try the water," I said. "It's our only chance." Mills nodded grimly. "I'll go first. If I don't make it." "You'll make it," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. He stripped off his heavy gear and slipped into the black water. The current took him immediately, pulling him into what looked like a narrow underwater passage. For a moment, I could see his flashlight beam dancing under the water. Then it disappeared. One by one, the other rangers followed. Chen went next, then the others. I went last, taking one final look at the cave symbols before the icy water closed over my head. The underwater passage was narrow and completely dark. I had to feel my way along the stone walls, fighting the current and trying not to panic as my lungs started burning for air. Just when I thought I couldn't hold my breath any longer, I saw light above. I broke the surface in another cave, gasping and coughing. Mills was pulling me out of the water, and I could see the others huddled near what looked like a natural exit. "We made it," Chen said, but he was shivering from more than just the cold water. Outside, we could see our vehicles in the distance. Behind us, the howling from the sealed caves sounded frustrated, angry. The creatures were too big to follow us through the underwater passage, but as we stumbled toward safety, I knew this wasn't over. Those things were still down there, still awake, still hunting. The official report called it a mining accident. According to the state investigators, the 3 Pennsylvania hunters had died from exposure to mine gases that had leaked from the new excavation site. The destroyed campsite and torn rifle were attributed to scavenging bears attracted by the smell of death. They found the hunters' bodies 3 days later, deep in one of the sealed caves. What was left of them anyway? Federal agents showed up within 24 hours of our report, confiscating all our photographs and physical evidence. The mining company quietly abandoned their operation, sealing all the blast sites with concrete and paying what they called environmental cleanup fees to the state. I tried to tell people what we'd really seen, but who was going to believe a story about 12-foot cave monsters? Even Jake, who'd been there with me, started talking about it like maybe we'd been confused by shadows and mine gases. But I know what I saw. We all do. 3 months later, I transferred to a desk job at the regional headquarters. Told everyone it was for family reasons, which wasn't entirely a lie. Sarah was worried about my nightmares, and the boys were scared of how jumpy I'd become. Every sound in the night made me reach for the rifle I kept beside the bed. The nightmares were always the same. 6-fingered hands reaching out of cave darkness. Yellow eyes watching from the tree line. That awful howling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I started researching similar incidents across the Appalachian region. Mining operations that were suddenly abandoned. Hiking trails that were mysteriously closed. Small communities where families just packed up and left without explanation. The pattern was always the same. Deep excavation, disturbing old cave systems. Workers reporting strange sounds and equipment malfunctions. Then accidents, disappearances, and official cover-ups. Moses Blackfeather came to see me once, about 6 months after the incident. He was in his 80s, one of the last people who still remembered the old Cherokee stories. My grandfather told me about the ancient hunger, he said, sitting in my office and drinking coffee from a paper cup. Said they went to sleep in the deep places when the world grew cold. But he also said they'd wake up again someday, when the mountain was wounded. What did your grandfather call them? Kexla Kudla, the old hungry ones. He said they used to take people, long before the white settlers came, take them down to the deep places and... He shrugged. Well, you've seen what they do. I still drive out to Devil's Backbone Ridge sometimes just to check. The concrete seals over the mine shafts are cracking. Livestock has been disappearing from farms in the area. Hikers report feeling watched from the forest, finding strange bone arrangements on the trails. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the fog rolls through the hollows, you can hear them howling. Far off, but getting closer. The mining company knew, I'm sure of it now. Their geological surveys would have shown the cave systems, maybe even found evidence of what was living down there. But they went ahead with the blasting anyway, because there was money to be made. They woke something up that had been sleeping for a very long time. Something that used to share these mountains with humans, back before we learned to be afraid of the dark. If you're planning to hike the deep hollows of West Virginia, respect the old boundaries. Don't camp near limestone caves. Don't follow strange voices calling for help. And if you see footprints with 6 toes leading into the darkness, turn around and walk away. Some things are better left sleeping, but I don't think they're sleeping anymore. My name is Douglas Fairfield, and I've been a park ranger in Georgia's Chattahoochee National Forest for 16 years. I know these mountains better than the back of my hand. I've fought more wildfires than I can count, pulled lost hikers off cliffs, and dealt with every kind of dangerous animal you can imagine. But I always laughed when the old-timers talked about the Wampus cat. Figured it was just mountain lions they dressed up with ghost stories. I was wrong. It was August 1981, the worst drought I'd ever seen. The thermometer hit over 100 degrees every day for 3 weeks straight. Everything was bone dry. the kind of conditions that make firefighters wake up in cold sweats. One spark could turn the whole forest into an inferno. Blood Mountain sits right in the heart of my territory. It's a massive granite dome that rises up from the forest like an ancient, sleeping giant. The Cherokee called this place sacred long before any white man set foot here. They had a name for the spirit that lived in these rocks. Iua, they called it. A shape-shifting cat that guarded the sacred stones. I'd heard the stories my whole life. My grandfather told them, and his grandfather before him. But after 16 years of dealing with real emergencies, lost kids, heart attacks on the hiking trails, drunk campers starting fires, I didn't have time for ghost stories. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning. I was checking the fire towers when my radio crackled to life. "Doug, you better get up to the Blood Mountain Trail. We got a weird one." That was Jenny Martinez, one of our newer rangers. She'd been working the eastern sector, where the Appalachian Trail cuts across Blood Mountain's face. "What kind of weird?" I asked, already heading toward my truck. "Fire damage, but..." She paused. "You need to see this yourself." I drove up the winding mountain road, dust clouds following my truck. The drought had turned everything brown. Leaves hung limp on the trees like they were already dead. When I reached the trailhead, Jenny was waiting for me with a look I'd never seen on her face before. "It's about a quarter mile up the trail," she said. "But Doug, I've been fighting fires for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like this." We hiked up the rocky path, sweat soaking through our uniforms. The forest was dead quiet, no birds, no insects, nothing. Even the squirrels had disappeared. That should have been my first real warning. Then I saw it. In a small clearing, there was a perfect circle of burned ground. The grass and leaves inside the circle were completely ash, but the fire had stopped exactly at an invisible line. Outside the circle, everything was untouched, not even singed. "How is that possible?" Jenny whispered. I knelt down and touched the edge of the burn. The ash was cold, like it had been there for days. But there hadn't been any lightning, no campfires allowed, no power lines for miles. "Maybe someone poured gasoline," I said, but even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. Gasoline fires don't stop in perfect circles. That's when I noticed the stones. In the center of the burned circle sat 5 granite rocks, each about the size of a basketball. They were arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a star. The rocks were covered in what looked like old scratches, lines and curves that reminded me of the Cherokee writing I'd seen in museums. "Jenny, call the state fire marshal. Tell them we might have an arson case." But as I stood up, something made me stop. A sound so low I felt it more than heard it. It was coming from the stones. They were humming. Over the next 3 days, we found 4 more burned circles. Each one was perfect. Each one had 5 stones in the center, and each one was humming that low, strange sound that made my teeth ache. The state fire marshal, a guy named Peterson, came up on Friday. He took pictures, collected samples, and shook his head a lot. "No accelerant residue," he told me. "No evidence of electrical ignition. Hell, Doug, I can't even figure out what burned hot enough to turn everything to ash but not touch the stuff right next to it." "What about the stones?" Peterson looked uncomfortable. "What about them?" "They're humming. That's just wind through the rock formations. Happens all the time in granite country." But I'd been in granite country my whole life, and rocks didn't hum like tuning forks. That weekend, I decided to camp near one of the circles. I told myself it was for fire prevention, but really, I needed to understand what was happening in my forest. I set up my tent about 50 yards from the 3rd circle we'd found, the one closest to the main trail. As the sun went down, the humming got louder. By the time full dark hit, it sounded like a choir of voices singing in a language I didn't recognize. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, big ones, heavy, moving through the dry leaves with a deliberate, careful pace. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. At first, I didn't see anything. Then my light caught something moving between the trees. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, moving on 4 legs but with a posture that seemed wrong somehow, like it could stand up if it wanted to. The fur was dark, almost black, and its eyes reflected my flashlight beam like amber mirrors. I'd seen plenty of black bears, even a few mountain lions. This wasn't either one. The creature stopped at the edge of the burned circle and looked right at me. For a moment that felt like forever. We stared at each other. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. It was like a woman screaming and a cat yowling at the same time, but louder than anything I'd ever heard. My tent shook. My ears rang. Somewhere in the distance, I heard car alarms going off, and we were 3 miles from the nearest road. When my vision cleared, the creature was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found tracks around the burned circle. They started as paw prints, huge ones, bigger than any mountain lion I'd ever seen. But halfway around the circle, something impossible happened. The paw prints turned into human footprints, not gradually, not like someone had walked behind an animal. The paw print was there, clear as day in the dirt, and the next track was a bare human foot. A woman's foot, by the size of it. I took pictures, made measurements, called it in. But when Peterson came back up, he took one look and shook his head. "Doug, you've been under a lot of stress. This drought, the fire danger, working double shifts. Maybe you should take some time off." That's when I knew I was on my own. I started doing research. I drove to the Cherokee Reservation and talked to Joseph Ridgerunner, their cultural liaison with the Park Service. Joseph was about 70, with gray hair down to his shoulders and eyes that seemed to see right through you. "You found the circles," he said before I could even explain why I was there. "You know about them?" My grandfather told me about them. His grandfather told him. "Blood Mountain is sacred ground, Mr. Fairfield. Has been for 1,000 years. The Iwa, the guardian spirit, she's been sleeping for a long time. But something woke her up." "Guardian spirit?" Joseph nodded. "She protects the sacred places, the burial sites, the ceremony grounds, the places where the veil between worlds is thin. When those places are threatened, she awakens." "Threatened by what?" "You tell me. What's changed recently? What new thing has disturbed the old places?" I thought about it. The only major change in the past year was the new visitor center they were building on the eastern face of Blood Mountain. Construction had started in the spring. "The building site," I whispered. "What did they have to dig up to pour that foundation?" Joseph asked. My stomach dropped. I remembered the construction reports. They'd found pottery shards, some old bones, what the archaeologist called Native American artifacts of undetermined age. The state had cleared the construction to continue after a brief survey. "They built on a burial ground," I said. Joseph's face was grim. "Then she won't stop until the balance is restored, one way or another." I raced back to Blood Mountain, my mind spinning with everything Joseph had told me. The construction site was about 2 miles from the first burned circle, connected by an old Cherokee trail that most hikers didn't even know existed. The visitor center was nearly finished, a modern building with big glass windows and a parking lot that could hold 50 cars. It was supposed to open for the fall tourist season, just 6 weeks away. I found the construction foreman, a guy named Mike Torres, cleaning up for the day. "Mike, when you dug the foundation, what exactly did you find?" He shrugged. "Bunch of old pottery pieces, some bones. The state guys came out, took pictures, said it was okay to keep building." "Why?" "Where did you put what you dug up?" "Dumpster behind the site. Should still be there if the trash company hasn't picked it up yet." I walked around to the back of the construction site. The dumpster was there, filled with broken concrete, rusty rebar, and plastic sheeting. But underneath, I could see fragments of pottery and what looked like pieces of bone. That's when the singing started. It wasn't coming from stones this time. It was coming from the dumpster. The pottery pieces and bones were humming the same low harmonic tune I'd heard in the burned circles. I backed away, my heart pounding. The sun was setting, painting the sky deep red. In the distance, I could hear something moving through the forest, something big. I got in my truck and called for backup on the radio. "Jenny, I need you up at the new visitor center site, and call the sheriff's department. Tell them we might have a dangerous animal situation." "What kind of animal?" Before I could answer, the screaming started. It came from the forest, that same impossible sound. Woman and cat and something else. Something that made every primitive instinct in my body tell me to run. The scream went on for almost a minute, echoing off the granite cliffs. When it stopped, the forest was completely silent. My radio crackled. "Doug? Doug, are you there? I heard that all the way at the station. What the hell was that?" "Just get up here," I said, "and bring a rifle." Jenny arrived 20 minutes later, along with Deputy Sheriff Tom Hawkins. Tom was a good old boy who'd grown up in these mountains. He'd heard the stories, too. "That's no mountain lion," he said, checking his rifle. "My granddad told me about sounds like that. Said the Cherokee had a word for the thing that made them." We set up floodlights around the construction site and waited. The pottery pieces in the dumpster were still humming, louder now, like they were calling to something. Around 10 o'clock, we got our answer. She came out of the tree line like a shadow made solid. In the harsh glare of the floodlights, I could see her clearly for the first time. She was beautiful and terrible, 8 feet tall, with the body of a massive cat, but standing upright on her hind legs like a person. Her fur was black as midnight, and her eyes glowed with their own amber light. When she moved, she seemed to shift between cat and human, and something in between. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, raising his rifle. "Don't shoot," I said, remembering Joseph's words about respect and balance. "She's protecting this place." The creature, the Ewa, looked at each of us in turn. When her gaze fell on me, I heard a voice in my head, speaking in perfect English. "The sacred dead have been disturbed. The balance must be restored." "What do you want?" I asked out loud. "Return what was taken, respect what was broken, or face the consequences." "The bones," Jenny whispered. "She wants the bones put back." But before any of us could move, we heard screaming from the forest. Human screaming. There were campers out there, a family with 2 kids, registered at the campground about a mile away. The Ewa heard it too. She turned toward the sound, and for a moment, her form flickered. I saw the face of a Cherokee woman, beautiful and sad and filled with ancient rage. Then she was running into the forest, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. We found the campsite 15 minutes later. The family's tent was shredded, like giant claws had torn through it. There was blood on the ground, but no bodies. The car was still there, keys in the ignition, but the family was gone. On a tree near the destroyed tent, carved deep into the bark with what looked like claw marks, was a message in Cherokee symbols. Can you read it? I asked Jenny. She shook her head. But Tom could. His grandmother had been Cherokee. It says, 3 days, he translated. Return the sacred dead, or the hunt continues. We had 3 days to figure out how to put ancient bones back in the ground, or more people were going to die. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with the park superintendent, the construction company, and Joseph Ridgerunner. The family was still missing. The FBI was involved now, treating it as a kidnapping case. I tried to explain about the Iwa, the sacred burial ground, the connection between the construction and the attacks. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Doug, the superintendent said carefully, you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you should take some time off, get some rest. People are missing, I shouted. And if we don't do something, more people are going to die. That's when Joseph spoke up. In the old days, when the sacred places were disturbed, the tribe had ways to make things right. Ceremonies to appease the guardians, rituals to restore the balance. What kind of rituals? I asked. The bones and artifacts must be returned to their proper place with respect and ceremony. The ground must be blessed, and someone must take responsibility for maintaining the sacred space. The construction company will never agree to that, the superintendent said. They've got too much money invested. Then more people will die, Joseph said simply. 2 more families went missing that night. By the 3rd day, the media had arrived. News vans filled the parking lot at the ranger station. Reporters were calling it the Blood Mountain Beast, and the governor was talking about bringing in the National Guard. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice in my head. 3 days. Time was up. That evening I made a decision that probably saved my life and definitely changed it forever. I gathered up all the bones and pottery fragments from the construction site dumpster and loaded them into my truck. Joseph met me at the old Cherokee trail that led to the original burial site. Are you sure about this? He asked. No, I said, but I'm sure about what happens if I don't try. We hiked up the trail by flashlight, carrying the remains in a canvas bag. The forest was completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Even the wind had stopped. The burial site was in a small clearing about halfway up Blood Mountain's eastern face. You could see the construction lights from there, bright and harsh against the natural darkness of the forest. Joseph began a ceremony in Cherokee, words I didn't understand, but that felt ancient and powerful. As he chanted, I carefully placed the bones and pottery pieces on the ground where they'd originally been buried. That's when she appeared. The Iwa stepped out of the shadows like she'd been there all along. Up close, without floodlights and fear clouding my vision, I could see the intelligence in her amber eyes, the sadness that seemed older than the mountains themselves. She looked at the returned artifacts, then at me. You understand, the voice said in my head. You respect the old ways. I'm trying to, I said out loud, but I need you to let those families go. They didn't know. They didn't mean any harm. The young ones are safe, hidden in the sacred caves until the balance is restored. But the builders, the ones who knew and did not care, they have paid the price. I thought about the 3 construction workers who'd been found that morning, killed by what the coroner called burns of unknown origin. You will be the guardian now, she continued. You will protect this place and others like it. You will stand between the 2 worlds. Before I could ask what that meant, she stepped forward and placed one massive paw on my chest. I felt fire run through my veins, and for a moment I saw the world through her eyes. I saw the network of sacred sites across the mountains, all connected by invisible threads of power. I saw the spirits of Cherokee warriors still standing guard over their ancestors' graves. I saw the damage that modern development was doing to places that had been holy for thousands of years. When the vision ended, I was lying on the ground. Joseph was kneeling beside me, looking worried. "Are you all right?" I sat up and looked at my chest. Through my torn shirt, I could see 4 parallel scars, like claw marks, but they formed a pattern that looked like Cherokee writing. "What does it say?" I asked. Joseph examined the scars and smiled. "Guardian," he said. "She marked you as a protector of the sacred places." The Iwa was gone, but I could feel her presence watching from the darkness. The missing families were found the next morning, safe and unharmed in a cave system that wasn't on any map. They had no memory of how they'd gotten there. The official report blamed the deaths on lightning strikes during a freak storm that no weather station recorded. The missing families were said to have gotten lost and found shelter in natural caves. The construction project was quietly canceled when the company's insurance refused to cover the site after repeated electrical anomalies. I never told anyone about that night on Blood Mountain, except for my daughter Sarah when she came home from college for Christmas. She listened to the whole story without saying a word, then asked if she could learn Cherokee from Joseph. Now she's studying indigenous cultures, helping to document traditional stories before they're lost forever. The scars on my chest never faded. Sometimes they burn when I'm near sacred sites that are under threat. It's like an early warning system, though I'm still learning to understand what the Iwa wants me to do with the information. I've had dreams about other guardian spirits awakening across the Appalachian region. The Cherokee aren't the only tribe whose sacred places are being disturbed by development. And the Iwa isn't the only spirit standing guard. Every month I hike up to the burial site and leave tobacco offerings just like Joseph taught me. Sometimes I see her watching from the tree line, amber eyes glowing in the darkness. She doesn't speak to me anymore, but I can feel her approval. The burned circles are still there, grass growing back in strange patterns that form Cherokee symbols meaning protected ground. Hikers sometimes report hearing singing stones and seeing a large cat-like shadow moving through the trees. But she doesn't hurt anyone who shows proper respect. Last month, they tried to build a resort on another Cherokee burial ground about 20 miles south. The same day they broke ground, spontaneous fires started appearing in perfect circles around the construction site. I got a call from the local sheriff. "Doug, we got a situation down here that might be in your area of expertise." I looked at the scars on my chest. They were burning like brands. "I'll be right there," I said. "The old guardians are waking up all across these mountains. Someone needs to stand between the modern world and the sacred places that keep the balance. Someone needs to make sure we remember that some things are more important than progress. My name is Douglas Fairfield, and I've been protecting these mountains for 16 years. But now I'm protecting them from more than just wildfires. Don't forget to ring that notification bell. These mountains hold secrets that need sharing with folks brave enough to listen. And if you ever find yourself camping near Blood Mountain, remember to show respect for the old places. The guardians are still watching, and they don't forget." My name is Harrison Blackwell, and for 11 years, I've been guiding folks through the deepest, darkest places on Earth. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, the world's longest cave system. Most tourists see maybe 2 miles of pretty formations and underground rivers. I've mapped over 50 miles of passages that don't appear on any official chart. People ask me why I left coal mining to become a park ranger. Truth is, after 8 years underground pulling black rock from the earth, I thought caves held no more mysteries for me. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. March 1967 started like any other spring in Kentucky. The snowmelt had the Green River running high and fast, flooding the lower cave entrances we usually used for deep expeditions. That left only the technical routes open, the ones that required ropes and crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. I'd been married to Sarah for 6 years by then. She wanted children, but I kept putting it off. Said we needed to save more money first. Truth was, I'd seen too many mining accidents, too many widows left with babies and no income. Cave work felt safer, but it was still dangerous enough that I didn't want to risk leaving a child fatherless. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Patricia Webb from the University of Kentucky had been leading a biological survey team in a section we called Devil's Throat, a series of chambers discovered just 2 months prior. They were studying the blind fish and cave crickets, documenting species that had never seen sunlight. 5 researchers total, all experienced cavers with proper equipment. They'd been down there 4 days. Radio contact was scheduled every 12 hours. They'd missed 2 check-ins. "Harrison," said Chief Ranger Morrison, a grizzled man who'd been working caves since before I was born, "I need you to take point on this rescue. You know Devil's Throat better than anyone. I'd been the one to map those chambers. Miles of limestone passages carved by underground rivers over millions of years. Some rooms were big enough to hold a cathedral. Others forced you to belly crawl through mud and water for hundreds of feet. The deepest point was over 400 feet below ground. Weather's been stable," I told Morrison as I checked my gear. Carbide lamp, backup flashlights, first aid kit, emergency food, over 300 feet of rope. No cave-ins reported. Could be equipment failure. Morrison nodded, but I could see the worry lines around his eyes. In 30 years of cave rescue, he'd seen everything from rock falls to hypothermia to simple panic attacks that turned deadly in the dark. "Take Zeke with you," he said, referring to Ezekiel Morrison, his younger brother and our most experienced cave guide. "And Harrison? Be careful down there. Something about this feels wrong." I should have paid more attention to that feeling. Morrison had survived 3 decades underground by trusting his instincts. The entrance to Devil's Throat was a crack in the limestone barely 3 feet wide. You had to shimmy through sideways, feeling the weight of the mountain pressing down from above. Most people got claustrophobic just thinking about it. To me, it felt like coming home. Zeke followed behind, our carbide lamps casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The air was cool and damp, carrying the mineral smell of limestone and the distant sound of flowing water. Normal cave sounds. Nothing to suggest 5 people had vanished without a trace. "How well did you know this research team?" Zeke asked as we rappelled down into the first major chamber. Dr. Webb seemed competent, been caving for 15 years. The students were green, but they followed safety protocols. I checked my watch. We'd been underground for an hour. Should reach their base camp in another 30 minutes. The base camp was where we found the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Their equipment was still there. Tents, sleeping bags, research materials. But everything was arranged in perfect geometric patterns. The sleeping bags formed a precise pentagon. The food supplies were stacked in identical pyramids. The battery-powered lanterns sat in a straight line, each exactly 2 feet from the next. No human being arranges their campsite like that. "Scientists are organized people," Zeke said, but his voice had an edge to it. I knelt beside the lanterns and checked them. Every battery was completely drained, even though the equipment manifest showed they'd brought fresh ones. "These should have lasted a week," I muttered. That's when we heard the first sound. It came from deeper in the cave system, echoing off the limestone walls. A scratching noise like fingernails dragging across rock, but slow and deliberate, not random, almost like communication. Zeke and I looked at each other. In all my years underground, I'd never heard anything like it. Probably just water erosion, I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. The spring floods shift things around. But caves don't usually make sounds that rhythmic, that purposeful. We gathered the research team's equipment and continued deeper into Devil's Throat, following the cave system toward the biological study sites. Our carbide flames flickered in the darkness ahead, casting jumping shadows that seemed to move independently of our lights. Something was very wrong down there, and we were walking straight toward it. The first body was Dr. Webb. We found her in what the research team had labeled Chamber 7, about 200 feet deeper than their base camp. She was sitting upright against the cave wall, perfectly positioned, like someone had carefully arranged her there. Her eyes were open but clouded, and her skin had taken on an unnaturally pale color that seemed to glow faintly in our lamplight. "Jesus Christ," Zeke whispered, crossing himself. I approached carefully, my medical training kicking in. No obvious trauma, no blood. But when I checked her pulse, her skin was ice cold despite the cave's constant 54-degree temperature. "How long has she been dead?" Zeke asked. "Hard to say. The cold preserves things down here." I examined her more closely. But look at this. Her fingernails had been worn down to bloody nubs, and there were fresh scratch marks in the limestone wall behind her. Deep gouges that would have taken considerable force to make, as if she'd been trying to claw her way through solid rock. "She was afraid of something," I said. That's when I noticed the bite marks. They were small, almost delicate, along her forearms and neck. Human-sized teeth, but the spacing was wrong. The canines were too far apart, and there were too many of them. Like someone with extra teeth had been gnawing on her. "Harrison," Zeke's voice was tight. "Look at this." He was shining his light on the cave wall about 10 feet away. Someone had scratched words into the limestone using what looked like fingernails or small tools. "They crawl." The letters were crude but deep, carved with desperate urgency. "Dr. Webb wrote this?" I asked. "Or one of the students?" Zeke played his light around the chamber. "Where are the other 4? We searched Chamber 7 thoroughly, but found only more evidence of strangeness. The research team's scientific instruments were arranged in the same geometric patterns we'd seen at base camp. Their specimen containers were empty, but lined up with mathematical precision. And everywhere, those scratching sounds echoed from deeper in the cave system. "We need to find the others," I said, though every instinct was telling me to get out of there immediately. The next chamber was connected by a crawlway barely 18 inches high. We had to remove our packs and push them ahead of us, worming through on our bellies like snakes. The limestone was smooth from centuries of water flow, and our carbide lamps threw crazy shadows ahead of us. Halfway through the crawl, Zeke grabbed my ankle. "Stop," he hissed. I froze, listening. At first, just the sound of our breathing and the distant drip of water. Then I heard it. Movement ahead of us in the darkness. Something large shifting around in the chamber we were crawling toward. "Animal?" I whispered. "Maybe." But Zeke didn't sound convinced. We lay there for several minutes, listening. The movement continued, a soft scraping sound like something being dragged across stone. Then silence. When we finally emerged into the next chamber, we found student researcher Michael Torres, or what was left of him. He'd been partially eaten. I've seen bear attacks during my mining days, and animal predation doesn't look like this. Whatever had fed on Torres had been methodical, almost surgical. Clean bite marks removed precise chunks of flesh, leaving the rest untouched. And like Dr. Webb, he'd been positioned carefully against the cave wall, as if on display. "What kind of animal does this?" Zeke asked, his voice barely steady. "None that I know of." I examined the bite patterns more closely. These look almost human. The scratching sounds started again, closer this time, coming from multiple directions around us, as if we were surrounded. Zeke swung his carbide lamp in wide arcs, but the light only reached about 15 feet before the cave darkness swallowed it completely. "We're being watched," he said. I felt it too. That prickly sensation between your shoulder blades when something is staring at you from behind. But every time we turned our lights toward the feeling, there was nothing there except limestone walls and empty darkness. Then I saw the hair, caught on a sharp rock formation about 8 feet up the cave wall, well above where any human could have reached without climbing equipment, was a tuft of hair. But it wasn't normal hair. It was completely white, almost translucent, and much finer than human hair. Like spider silk woven together. "How did that get up there?" Zeke asked. I couldn't answer, because that's when we heard the clicking. It started as a single sound, like someone snapping their fingers underwater. Then it multiplied. Click, 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 coming from the darkness ahead of us, behind us, above us. A complex rhythm that sounded almost like language. Communication. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." But as we turned to head back through the crawlway, Zeke's lamp illuminated something that made my blood freeze. Carved into the cave wall, in the same desperate scratching as before, was a message. "Don't let them learn." Below that, in fresher scratches. Too late. The clicking sounds were getting louder, more urgent, and in the peripheral vision of my carbide flame, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving through the shadows. Something that walked on all fours but had the general shape of a person. Something that had been watching us this entire time. "Move!" I shouted. We dove for the crawlway, pushing our packs ahead of us and scrambling through the tight space as fast as we could. Behind us, the clicking intensified, joined by new sounds. A wet sliding noise like something large being dragged across wet stone. They were following us. Whatever had killed Dr. Webb and Torres was hunting us through the caves, and we were 400 feet underground with nowhere to run. We made it back to the research team's base camp, but we weren't alone. The clicking sounds followed us through every crawlway and chamber, always just at the edge of our lamplight. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, a pale flash disappearing around a corner, or something scuttling across the cave ceiling too quickly to focus on. "What are they?" Zeke asked as we caught our breath in the geometric arrangement of camping equipment. "I don't know." I checked our supplies. We had enough carbide for maybe 6 more hours, and the emergency flashlights wouldn't last much longer. "But they're intelligent. Look at how they arranged all this gear." It wasn't random. The more I studied the patterns, the more deliberate they seemed. The sleeping bags formed a perfect pentagon with the food supplies at each point. The scientific instruments were sorted by size and material. Even the trash had been organized by type and stacked in neat piles. They're studying us, I realized, like we're the specimens now. The clicking started again, but this time it came from above. I tilted my carbide lamp toward the cave ceiling and saw them. 3 pale figures clung to the limestone like spiders, their elongated limbs twisted at impossible angles to grip the rock face. They were roughly human-shaped, but wrong in every proportion. Too long in the arms and legs, too thin through the torso, with oversized hands that ended in yellowed claws. And their eyes. Even in the flickering carbide light, their eyes reflected like an animal's, wide and unblinking and far too large for their elongated skulls. One of them clicked at the others, and they scuttled away into the darkness with fluid, boneless movements. "Did you see?" Zeke started. "Yeah." My voice came out as barely a whisper. Jesus Christ, I saw them. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the creatures moving around us in the darkness. They seemed to be everywhere, above us, below us, in every passage leading away from the chamber. We were surrounded. "Harrison," Zeke said quietly, "in 30 years of cave work, I've never seen anything like this." Neither had I. But I was starting to remember stories my grandfather used to tell about the coal mines. Stories about Tommyknockers, creatures that lived deep underground and warned miners about cave-ins. Most people thought they were just folklore, but Grandpa swore he'd heard them tapping in the walls just before the Harlan County mine collapse of 1932. "My grandfather used to work these hills," I said. "He told stories about things living in the deep places." "You think these are the same creatures?" "I think we just found out what happened to the people who went too deep and never came back." The clicking was getting more complex, almost like conversation. Different tones and rhythms coming from various directions around us. They were coordinating. "We need to find the other 3 students," I said, though the rational part of my mind knew we probably wouldn't find them alive. "Are you insane? We need to get out of here. The only way out is through flooded passages. Spring melt has blocked the other exits." I checked my map. Besides, they know these caves better than we do now. They'll hunt us down no matter which direction we run. Zeke was quiet for a moment, then nodded grimly. "So what's the plan?" "We find the rest of the research team, gather what evidence we can, and try to understand what we're dealing with." I shouldered my pack. Maybe there's something in their research that explains this. We left the base camp following the path the research team would have taken toward the deepest biological study sites. The caves grew narrower and more complex, branching into dozens of passages that led in every direction. Without a map, we would have been lost within minutes. The creatures followed us, but they kept their distance now. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of pale movement in a side passage, or hear the scratch of claws on limestone. They were learning our behavior, studying how we moved and reacted. We found the next student in Chamber 12, almost at the deepest mapped point of Devil's Throat. Jennifer Walsh had been positioned like the others, sitting upright against the cave wall. But she was still alive. "Help me," she whispered when our lights found her. "Please help me." I knelt beside her, checking for injuries. She was hypothermic and dehydrated, probably in shock, but physically she seemed unharmed except for those same strange bite marks on her arms and neck. "Jennifer, what happened to your team?" I asked gently. "They came out of the walls," she said, her voice distant and dreamy. "White things, moving like spiders. They took Gary and Tom first." "Where are Gary and Tom now?" "Deeper." She pointed into the darkness beyond our lamplight. "They're keeping them deeper, in the breeding chambers." Breeding chambers. That made my skin crawl. "Jennifer, we're going to get you out of here," I said, but she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "You can't leave," she whispered urgently. "They've been watching the tours, learning about the surface. They know about the outside world now." The clicking sounds intensified around us, and I saw more pale figures moving in the shadows at the edge of our light. At least 6 or 7 of them, maybe more. "They're coming," Jennifer said. "They want to see what you know." That's when I realized the truth. These creatures hadn't just been hunting the research team. They'd been interrogating them, learning everything they could about human society, technology, and the surface world. The pale crawlers weren't just cave dwellers. They were planning something. "Zeke," I said quietly, "we need to move. Now." But as we helped Jennifer to her feet, the clicking sounds suddenly stopped. The cave went completely silent except for the sound of our breathing and the distant drip of water. Then, from the darkness ahead of us, came a voice. Human words, spoken in perfect English, but with an accent I'd never heard before. Harrison Blackwell, cave guide, 11 years experience, married to Sarah, no children. My blood turned to ice. How could they know that? "They've been listening," Jennifer whispered, "learning our language. They know everything about everyone who's ever taken the cave tours." The voice came again, closer this time. "Take us to the surface, Harrison Blackwell. Show us the world above." In the flickering light of our carbide lamps, I saw them emerging from every passage around us. Dozens of pale, elongated figures moving with fluid grace across the cave walls and ceiling. Their large eyes reflected our lamplight like mirrors, and their mouths were full of too many teeth. We were surrounded by an entire colony of creatures that had spent decades learning about humanity by observing our cave tours. And now they wanted to see the surface world for themselves, with us as their guides. The pale crawler who spoke to us was larger than the others, with more elaborate scarification covering its translucent white skin. When it moved into the full light of our carbide lamps, I could see that it wore primitive jewelry made from bone and metal, pieces that looked suspiciously like they came from human sources. "I am the memory keeper," it said in that strange, accented English. "I have learned your words from many voices over many seasons." The cave tours, I realized. "You've been listening to the guided tours." "Yes." The words stretched out with a sibilant hiss. 11 years, Harrison Blackwell has brought food to us, brought knowledge. Now we hunger for more. Jennifer was shaking in my arms, mumbling something about breeding chambers and surface plans. The other creatures maintained their positions around us, at least 20 of them clinging to the walls and ceiling like enormous pale spiders. "What happened to the research team?" I asked. The memory keeper tilted its oversized head, studying me with those reflective eyes. "They taught us much about your science, your instruments, your world above." It gestured to one of the smaller creatures, which scuttled forward carrying what looked like Dr. Webb's research notebook. "We learned to read your marks on paper." Zeke shifted nervously beside me, his carbide lamp flickering. "Harrison, our light's getting low." I knew. We had maybe an hour of carbide left, and then we'd be in complete darkness with creatures that could see perfectly without any light at all. The memory keeper continued. "Your kind has forgotten the deep places, but we remember when the ice came, when your ancestors joined us in the warm caves below. Most died. Some adapted." The implications hit me like a physical blow. These weren't just cave creatures. They were evolved humans. People who had taken shelter underground during the Ice Age and never left. They'd spent thousands of years adapting to cave life, developing pale skin, enhanced senses, and the ability to move through tight spaces. "You're human," I breathed. "We were human. Now we are more." The memory keeper moved closer, and I could smell its breath, metallic and wrong, like old blood. "But we remember the surface, the sun, The green growing things. We want to return. Why now? You've been down here for thousands of years. Because you brought us knowledge. Every tour, every visitor. We learned more about your modern world, your machines, your weapons, your cities. Its mouth curved in something that might have been a smile, revealing rows of pointed teeth. Now we are ready. The other creatures began clicking more urgently, and I realized this was some kind of council meeting. They were debating what to do with us. They want to use us as guides, Jennifer whispered, to lead them to the surface. They've been planning this for years. And if we refuse? The Memory Keeper's laugh was like fingernails on stone. There is no refusal, Harrison Blackwell. You have two choices. Guide us above, or join your research friends in the deep feeding chambers. That's when I saw them bring out Gary and Tom. The two graduate students were still alive, but barely. They'd been changed somehow. Their skin had taken on the same pale, translucent quality as the creatures, and their eyes had grown larger and more reflective. They moved with the same boneless fluidity as their captors. They're adapting them, I realized with horror, converting them. The deep places change those who stay long enough, the Memory Keeper confirmed. Your friends will join us soon, as will you if you choose to remain. I looked at Zeke, saw the same desperate determination in his eyes that I felt. We weren't getting out of this by negotiating. I need to check our route back to the surface, I said carefully, pulling out my cave map. The spring floods have changed the passages. The Memory Keeper moved closer, studying the map with obvious intelligence. Show us the path, Harrison Blackwell. Show us the way to your sun world. I spread the map on the cave floor, pointing to various passages while thinking frantically. We were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of light. But I still had some mining explosives in my pack, small charges we used for clearing rock falls. This passage here connects to the main tourist route, I said, pointing to a section near the deepest part of the system. But there's been some structural damage from the flooding. As the creatures gathered around the map, I caught Zeke's eye and nodded slightly toward my pack. He understood immediately. The tourist elevators can carry about 20 people at a time. I continued, trying to keep my voice steady while Zeke quietly retrieved the explosive charges. But you'd need to go in small groups. We are patient, the Memory Keeper said. We have waited generations. We can wait a little longer to reclaim the surface world. Just one problem, I said, standing up slowly. I lied about the route. Before the Memory Keeper could react, I triggered the first explosive charge. The detonation in the narrow cave passage was deafening, and the shockwave knocked several of the pale crawlers from their positions on the walls. But more importantly, it collapsed part of the ceiling, creating a barrier between us and some of our attackers. "Run!" I shouted to Zeke and Jennifer. We plunged into the chaos, our carbide lamps swinging wildly as creatures screeched and clicked all around us. Some of them moved to block our escape route, but Zeke had grabbed a piece of sharp limestone and was fighting with the desperate fury of a man who knew he was about to die. I triggered the second charge near the chamber entrance, bringing down more rock and creating temporary cover. The explosion echoed through the cave system like thunder, and I heard the sound of rushing water. We'd breached one of the underground rivers. "The flood passages," Jennifer shouted over the noise. "If we can reach the flooded section, they won't follow us into the water." It was a desperate plan. The flooded passages were completely submerged, and we'd have to swim underwater for over 100 yards to reach the next air pocket. In cave diving, that kind of distance was nearly impossible without proper equipment. But it was our only chance. Behind us, The memory keeper was screaming orders in its own clicking language, and dozens of pale figures were scuttling over the fallen rocks like insects. They moved faster than any human could, their elongated limbs giving them incredible agility in the tight cave spaces. We reached the flooded passage just as the first creatures caught up to us. Zeke turned and fought them off while Jennifer and I prepared for the underwater swim. "I can't make it that far," she said, looking at the black water that stretched ahead into darkness. "You have to try," I said. "It's the only way out." The water was shockingly cold, probably fed by snowmelt from the surface. I took the deepest breath of my life and plunged in, pulling Jennifer behind me. Swimming through a flooded cave passage is like flying through liquid darkness. Your lights barely penetrate the murky water, and you have no idea what's ahead or how far you have to go. The limestone walls press in around you, and if you panic and try to surface too early, you'll smash your head on solid rock. My lungs were burning by the time I saw light ahead. Not artificial light, but the gray glow of daylight filtering down from the surface. We'd made it to the natural entrance pool. We broke the surface gasping and choking, pulling ourselves onto a narrow ledge barely wide enough for two people. Jennifer was unconscious, but breathing. Behind us, the flooded passage remained empty. The pale crawlers had chosen not to follow us through the water. But I could hear them in the darkness, clicking and calling to each other. They'd find another way out eventually. We'd escaped. But I knew it was only temporary. The official report stated that the University of Kentucky research team died in a cave-in caused by spring flooding. Dr. Patricia Webb, Michael Torres, and Jennifer Walsh were listed as victims of geological instability and hypothermic exposure. Gary Matthews and Tom Richardson were classified as missing, presumed dead. No mention of pale crawlers. No mention of an underground civilization. No mention of creatures that had spent millennia learning about the surface world. 2 days after our escape, federal authorities arrived at Mammoth Cave National Park. They claimed to be conducting a geological survey, but their equipment looked more military than scientific. They set up around Devil's Throat and began sealing passages with a special concrete mixture that hardened like stone. "Structural safety concerns," they told Chief Ranger Morrison. "The cave system is too unstable for public access." I tried to tell them what we'd really found down there, but my report was classified and buried. Jennifer Walsh spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility, claiming she couldn't remember anything after entering the caves. Zeke transferred to surface duties and refused to talk about what happened. But I knew the truth. Those creatures were still down there, just temporarily blocked from their planned route to the surface, and they were smart enough to find other ways out. The nightmares started 2 weeks later. Dreams of pale figures crawling through my house at night, studying my sleeping wife, learning about our surface world through careful observation. I'd wake up in cold sweats, certain I could hear that distinctive clicking communication in the walls of our home. Sarah noticed the change immediately. "You're different since that rescue," she said one morning over breakfast. "Jumpy, always listening for something." I couldn't tell her the truth. How do you explain to someone that an entire civilization of evolved cave dwellers is planning to reclaim the surface world? That they've spent decades listening to tourist guides describe modern society, learning our weaknesses and capabilities. Instead, I threw myself into research. I started studying cave systems throughout the Appalachian region, looking for similar patterns of unexplained disappearances and sealed passages. What I found terrified me. Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. 3 researchers vanished in 1963, cave subsequently restricted. Luray Caverns in Virginia. Entire geological survey team disappeared in 1965, sections permanently closed to the public, Jewel Cave in South Dakota, unexplained deaths and federal intervention in 1966. The pale crawlers weren't unique to Mammoth Cave. They were everywhere, throughout every major cave system in North America. And based on the pattern of closures and disappearances, they were all planning the same thing: a coordinated return to the surface. I started keeping detailed records, documenting seismic activity around sealed cave entrances, monitoring for signs of new tunnel construction. The creatures were intelligent and patient, but they were also active. Ground-penetrating radar showed extensive new passage development in areas that should have been geologically stable. They were digging new routes to the surface. 6 months after the incident, I received a transfer to Yellowstone National Park. "Fresh start," Morrison said, but I could see the relief in his eyes. I'd become a liability, someone who knew too much and asked too many questions. On my last day at Mammoth Cave, I visited the sealed entrance to Devil's Throat. The federal concrete was already showing hairline cracks, and I could swear I heard faint clicking sounds from somewhere deep below. At Yellowstone, I established myself as a cave safety expert, someone who specialized in identifying and sealing hazardous underground areas. It was perfect cover for my real mission: monitoring and documenting the pale crawler expansion across the western cave systems. Because I'd realized something during those long nights of research and nightmares. The creatures weren't just planning to return to the surface, they were planning to replace us. They'd learned our language, our technology, our social structures. They'd studied human behavior for decades through carefully observing cave tourists. And they had capabilities we couldn't match: perfect dark vision, enhanced hearing, the ability to move through spaces no normal human could navigate. Most importantly, they could convert captured humans into their own kind. Gary and Tom weren't dead. They were being transformed into something that could pass for human while serving the pale crawler agenda. The perfect infiltrators. Sarah left me in 1969. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said as she packed her belongings. "You're obsessed with these caves, these theories. You won't even tell me what really happened down there." I let her go. It was safer for her not to know. By 1970, I'd documented evidence of pale crawler activity in over 40 cave systems across North America. Unexplained disappearances, federal interventions, geological anomalies that suggested extensive underground construction projects. They were preparing for something big. I tried to warn people. I sent reports to the FBI, the CIA, the Department of the Interior. All of them were classified or dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized cave rescue specialist suffering from PTSD. But I kept watching, kept documenting, kept sealing passages when I could get away with it. Because I knew that someday, sooner than anyone realized, the pale crawlers would be ready to reclaim the world their ancestors had abandoned. And when that day came, humanity would face an enemy that had spent thousands of years studying our weaknesses while developing capabilities we couldn't imagine. The Memory Keeper had been right about one thing. They were patient. They'd waited generations to return to the surface, but their waiting was almost over. Late at night, when the wind blows through the cave entrances at Yellowstone, I sometimes think I can hear them clicking in the darkness below, planning, preparing, learning. And I know that Harrison Blackwell, cave guide and reluctant sentinel, might be the only person left who remembers what's really waiting in the deep places beneath our feet. The pale crawlers are coming, and we're not ready for them. My name is Samuel Ironwood, and I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 22 years. In all that time, I thought the most dangerous thing a camper might face was a hungry black bear, or maybe getting lost on the trails. The harvest moon of October 1959 taught me I was dead wrong. I know these mountains like the back of my hand. Every trail, every stream, every hidden valley between North Carolina and Tennessee. Started as a hunting guide when I was young, before the Park Service hired me. Got a wife, Sarah, and 5 kids back home in Gatlinburg. At 48, I figured I'd seen everything these ancient hills could throw at me. The Cherokee folks who still live around here, they got stories. Always have. They talk about the moon-eyed people, pale folks who lived in these mountains long before the Cherokee arrived. According to the old tales, there was a great war, and the Cherokee drove them out. But some of the elders, they whisper that driving them out and killing them all are 2 different things. I never put much stock in old stories. Moon-eyed people were probably just albino individuals, maybe folks with some kind of condition that made them look different. The Cherokee needed a way to explain what they didn't understand. That's what I told myself anyway. October started cold that year, colder than usual. The leaves were turning brilliant reds and golds, bringing in tourists from all over to see the fall colors. Perfect camping weather if you could handle the chilly nights. The harvest moon was coming, that big, bright, full moon that rises just after sunset in October. It's always been popular with campers who like to hike by moonlight. I was stationed up near Cataract Falls, about 60 miles of mountain trails from the nearest proper road. No telephone lines up there, just a radio that worked when the weather was good. It was quiet country, the kind of place where you could hear a twig snap from 100 yards away. The first report came in on October 15th. A family from Virginia, the Hendersons, had been camping near the falls. They packed up in the middle of the night and hiked out in the dark, which any experienced camper will tell you is about the stupidest thing you can do. When they reached the ranger station down in the valley, they were shaking and wouldn't stop looking over their shoulders. Something came to our camp, Mr. Henderson told my colleague Jim Parker. Looked like people, but wrong somehow. Pale as ghosts and moving through the trees like they were part of them. Mrs. Henderson was crying. They were hunting us. I could feel it, like we were deer and they were deciding which one to take first. Jim wrote it up as a possible bear encounter. Bears can walk upright sometimes, and at night, scared people see all sorts of things that aren't there. Made sense to me at the time. The second report came 3 days later. Different family, same story. Pale, figures moving through the forest, watching their camp from the shadows. This time, the campers found strange marks carved into trees around their site. Symbols nobody recognized, cut fresh into the bark. By October 20th, we had 5 separate reports. All the same basic story, pale, human-like figures stalking campers during the full moon. All in the same general area above Cataract Falls, the area I was responsible for. That's when headquarters sent me up to investigate. Probably just one person messing with tourists, my supervisor said. Some local playing pranks. You know how these mountain folks can be about outsiders. I packed my gear and hiked up to my cabin near the falls. It was a beautiful October afternoon, the kind that makes you grateful to work outdoors. The forest was alive with the sounds it should make. Squirrels chattering, birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze. Everything seemed normal. But as the sun went down and that big harvest moon came up, the forest went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl because it means everything with sense has found somewhere else to be. That first night, I sat on my cabin porch with a cup of coffee, listening to nothing. No owls hooting, No raccoons rustling through the underbrush. No deer moving through the trees. Just silence so thick it felt like a blanket pressed over the whole mountain. Around midnight, I heard it. A whistle, low and musical, coming from up the ridge. Then another one answered from across the valley. Then a third, from somewhere behind my cabin. Those weren't any bird calls I'd ever heard. They were signals, coordinated, intelligent. Something was out there in my forest, and it was organizing itself for a hunt. The next morning, I found the tracks. Not bear tracks, not deer tracks. Human tracks, but wrong. The toes were spread too wide, like fingers grabbing at the ground. The heel was deeper than normal, and there were marks that looked like claws or very long toenails. They circled my cabin in a perfect ring, about 30 feet out. Whoever made them had stood there in the dark, watching me through my windows while I sat on the porch drinking coffee. The hair on my neck stood up. In 22 years of ranger work, I'd never seen anything like those prints. They were fresh, made sometime after the dew fell but before sunrise. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and the tracks were clear as day. I followed them into the forest. The trail led uphill toward the old Cherokee hunting grounds, winding between massive hemlock trees that were ancient when my grandfather was born. The tracks stayed in single file, like a military patrol. Every 100 yards or so, they split off, one set going left, one going right, then coming back together, like they were scouting. The trail led to a clearing where I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, but not like any I'd ever seen. The fire ring was made from carefully stacked flat stones, perfectly round and level. But there was no ash, no charcoal, no sign that a fire had ever been built there. Around the ring, the grass was pressed down in precise patterns, not random like people walking around, but organized, deliberate. On the trees surrounding the clearing, symbols were carved into the bark, fresh cuts made with something sharp. They weren't random scratches. They were a language, or at least a marking system. Some of the symbols looked familiar, like simplified versions of Cherokee writing, but others were completely foreign. Then I saw the bones. Small ones at first. Rabbits, squirrels, maybe a raccoon. They were arranged in neat piles, sorted by size. But these weren't the scattered remains of a predator's meal. Every bone had been picked clean, and many showed cut marks, tool marks. At the far edge of the clearing, under a massive oak tree, I found larger bones. My hands shook as I knelt down to examine them. Deer femur, deer skull, and then something that made me sit down hard in the leaves. A human jawbone, adult, from the size of the teeth. I'm not ashamed to admit I threw up right there. 22 years in these mountains, dealing with everything from bear attacks to hiking accidents, and I'd never seen anything that hit me like that single piece of bone. I wrapped it in my spare shirt and headed back to the cabin. Had to get on the radio, call for backup, maybe get some state police up here with proper investigation equipment. This was way beyond anything park rangers were trained to handle. But the radio wouldn't work. Static on every channel, even the emergency frequencies. Just a low humming sound that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. As the sun went down, I heard them again. The whistles coming from all around. But this time they were closer. I barricaded myself inside the cabin and waited. Around 10 o'clock, something scratched at the door. Long, slow scratches, like fingernails dragging across wood. Then silence. A few minutes later, scratches at the back window. Then the side window. They were testing, looking for a way in. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the front window. The beam caught something pale moving between the trees. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, moving in a way that made my eyes want to look away. Then it was gone. The scratching stopped. The whistles faded. But I could feel them out there, watching, waiting. The next morning brought my first real look at what I was dealing with. Just after sunrise, I found a deer carcass hung from a tree branch about 50 yards from my cabin. It had been butchered expertly, the hide removed in one piece, the meat cut away with precision. But it was the way it was hung that bothered me. Upside down, arms spread wide, positioned so it would be the first thing I saw when I stepped out my door. It was a message. A warning, maybe. Or a promise. That afternoon, a family from Georgia arrived to camp at the designated site near the falls. The Morgans, husband, wife, 2 kids about 10 and 12 years old. They seemed like experienced campers, had all the right gear, knew how to set up properly. I should have turned them away. Should have told them the area was closed for maintenance or some other official-sounding excuse. But they'd hiked 60 miles to get here, and I didn't have any real proof of danger, just some strange tracks and a feeling in my gut. I gave them the standard safety briefing about bears and proper food storage, told them to keep their fire burning all night and to make noise if they saw any wildlife. Figured I'd check on them every few hours just to be safe. Big mistake. Around midnight, their screaming woke me up. I grabbed my rifle and a lantern and ran toward their campsite. The screaming had stopped by the time I was halfway there, which somehow made it worse than if it had continued. I found their camp destroyed, tent torn apart, sleeping bags shredded, camping gear scattered through the trees. The fire was out, scattered into cold ash and embers. Mrs. Morgan was sitting on a log, holding her daughter and rocking back and forth. Both of them were covered in blood, though I couldn't tell if it was theirs or someone else's. Mr. Morgan was nowhere to be seen. Neither was the boy. "Where is your husband?" I asked Mrs. Morgan. "Where's your son?" She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "They took them," she whispered. "The pale ones. They came out of the trees like ghosts, silent as death until..." She started crying again. Until what? Until they started laughing. I got Mrs. Morgan and her daughter back to my cabin and radioed for emergency evacuation. This time the radio worked, crackling to life like it had never been broken. A helicopter picked them up at dawn, and I filed my report. 2 missing persons, probable abduction, request for search and rescue teams. What I didn't put in the report was what Mrs. Morgan told me during that long night in my cabin. "There were 7 or 8 of them," she said, clutching her coffee mug like it was an anchor. "Tall and thin, white as bone, but not sick white, more like they'd never seen sunlight. They moved through the trees without making a sound, like they were floating." She took a shaky breath. "They had tools, spears, I think, with stone points, and they worked together like they'd done this 1,000 times before. 3 came from the front, 2 from each side, 1 from behind. They surrounded us before we even knew they were there." Her daughter, 10-year-old Emma, hadn't spoken since I found them. She just stared at the cabin wall and flinched whenever a tree branch scraped against the roof. "They took my husband first," Mrs. Morgan continued. "Hit him with something, and he went down. But he was still breathing when they dragged him away. Still breathing. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, the search and rescue teams had found nothing. No bodies, no blood trail, no sign of where the Morgans had been taken. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. That's when Joe Sequoia arrived. Joe was Cherokee, worked as a ranger on the Tennessee side of the park. We'd known each other for years, shared information about wildlife patterns and trail conditions. but I'd never seen him look the way he did that Thursday morning when he hiked up to my cabin. Serious, worried, maybe even scared. "My grandfather wants to talk to you," he said without any greeting. "About what you found up here." Joe's grandfather was Daniel Sequoia, 93 years old, and one of the last fluent speakers of Old Cherokee. If the traditional stories meant anything to anyone, it was to him. We hiked down to the Cherokee settlement that afternoon. Daniel was waiting for us in his kitchen, a small man with hands like tree roots and eyes sharp as flint. "The pale ones are hunting again," he said. Not a question. I nodded. "My great-grandfather fought them," Daniel continued. "Before the white men came, before we were forced west. They lived in the deep places, the caves and hidden valleys. We called them Kitua Anivwi, the ancient enemies." Joe translated, though I was getting the general idea. "They're not like us," Daniel went on. "Older, stronger, built for hunting in darkness. For 1,000 years there was war between our peoples. We won, eventually, drove them so deep into the mountains that they became stories." He paused, studying my face. "But stories don't kill families, Ranger. Stories don't leave tracks around your cabin." Daniel stood up and walked to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room. From inside, he pulled out something wrapped in deerskin. When he unwrapped it, I saw a spear point unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It was made from black stone, knapped to a razor edge, and carved with symbols similar to what I'd found on the trees. "We took this from one of them, maybe 200 years ago," Daniel said. "Kept it as a reminder, as a warning." The stone felt cold in my hands, heavier than it should have been. "They hunt by the moon," Daniel explained. "New moon they sleep, quarter moon they scout, but full moon..." He shook his head. "Full moon they take what they need." "What do they need?" I asked. Daniel's face went grim. "Fresh meat. And new blood for their tribe." That night, back at my cabin, I understood what he meant. I was studying topographical maps, trying to figure out where the pale ones might have taken the Morgans, when I heard voices coming from the forest. Human voices, but wrong somehow. Too high, too musical, like singing in a language I didn't recognize. I grabbed my rifle and lantern and crept out onto the porch. The singing was coming from the direction of Cataract Falls, maybe half a mile away. It rose and fell like a lullaby, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Then it stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something else. Screaming. Human screaming, high and desperate and full of pain. Mr. Morgan's voice. I wanted to run toward it, to help, but my feet wouldn't move. Every instinct I'd developed in 22 years of mountain work told me that moving toward that sound would be suicide. Whatever was happening at the falls, it was meant to be heard. It was meant to draw people in. The screaming went on for maybe 10 minutes. Then it cut off abruptly, and the singing resumed. I spent the rest of that night sitting on my porch with my rifle across my knees, listening to voices in the dark. They were closer now, maybe 100 yards away. Sometimes the singing would stop, and I'd hear what sounded like conversation, discussion, planning. When dawn broke, I found fresh tracks all around my cabin, dozens of them, from at least 12 different individuals. They'd surrounded my cabin completely, standing just at the edge of the lantern light, watching me watch the darkness. That morning, I made a decision. I couldn't protect campers if I didn't know what I was protecting them from. And I couldn't get back up if I couldn't prove what was happening. I was going to track them to their lair. Joe Sequoia met me at the trailhead with a pack full of Cherokee hunting gear, traditional weapons, rope made from plant fibers, and a collection of what he called protection items. Small leather pouches filled with herbs and carved bone, designed to ward off evil spirits. "My grandfather says you're either very brave or very stupid," Joe told me as we started up the trail. "Probably both," I admitted. The tracks led us deeper into the mountains than I'd ever been, following animal paths and creek beds through forests so old they felt like cathedrals. We found more camps, more bone piles, more trees marked with symbols. The farther we went, the more organized it all appeared. This wasn't random hunting. This was civilization. We found the entrance late that afternoon, hidden behind a waterfall in a narrow canyon. It was a cave mouth, but not natural. The edges were too smooth, too precisely carved. Steps had been cut into the rock, leading down into darkness. "This is where the old stories come from," Joe said quietly. "The deep places where the ancient enemies lived." We could hear them down there, voices echoing up from the depths, along with other sounds I didn't want to identify. The smell that came out of the cave was like nothing I'd experienced. Ancient, organic, wrong. That's when we saw Emma Morgan. She was sitting on a rock ledge about 20 feet down the cave entrance, just visible in the dying afternoon light. Alive, but changed somehow. Her skin was pale as milk, and her eyes reflected light like an animal's. "Emma," I called softly. "It's Ranger Ironwood. I'm here to help you." She looked up at me and smiled. When she opened her mouth to speak, I saw that her teeth had been filed to points. "They're teaching me to hunt," she said in a voice that sounded like her own, but felt completely different. "They say I have the gift, the sight that works in darkness. Where's your father, Emma? Where's your brother?" Her smile got wider. "They're part of the tribe now. We all are." That's when the singing started again, coming from deep in the cave. Emma stood up and began walking down into the darkness, moving with a grace that no 10-year-old should possess. Joe grabbed my arm. "We have to go, now." But it was too late. They were coming up. The first one that emerged from the cave was everything the stories had described, and worse. 7 feet tall, thin as a skeleton but with muscles like steel cables under skin the color of old bone. Its face was human-shaped but stretched wrong, with eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like mirrors. It carried a spear tipped with that same black stone I'd seen in Daniel's kitchen, and it moved with the fluid grace of something that had spent centuries perfecting the art of killing. Behind it came others. 6, then 8, then more than I could count in the growing darkness. Men, women, and children, if you could call them that. All pale, all wrong, all armed with weapons that looked like they'd been made from the forest itself. And among them, walking like he belonged there, was Mr. Morgan. He'd been changed like his daughter. Skin bleached white, teeth filed sharp, eyes that caught and held light. But unlike Emma, he seemed to recognize me. "Samuel," he said, and his voice was his own even though everything else was different. "They've been waiting for you. The ranger who protects their hunting grounds." "What did they do to you, Frank?" I asked, though I was backing away even as I spoke. "They showed me the truth," he replied, "about what these mountains really are, about who was here first." The tall one, their leader maybe, stepped forward and spoke in a voice like wind through dry leaves. The language was nothing I'd ever heard, but somehow I understood the meaning. "You have protected our territory well, Ranger, but now you must choose. Join us, or feed us." Joe raised his rifle, but before he could fire, 3 of them were on him. They moved so fast they seemed to flicker, like images on a broken television. Joe went down under a pile of pale bodies, and his scream echoed off the canyon walls. I ran. 22 years of hiking these mountains, and I'd never moved so fast. Behind me, I could hear them following, not crashing through the underbrush like normal people would, but flowing through the forest like water, silent as death. I made it maybe half a mile before they surrounded me in a clearing near Cataract Falls, the same clearing where I'd found the strange campsite days before. They came out of the trees on all sides, moving in the coordinated way that marked them as predators who had hunted together for lifetimes. In the center of the group stood Emma Morgan, no longer looking like a scared little girl. She looked like a young queen, confident and cold, and completely at home in the darkness. "Grandfather Daniel was right," she said. "The old war never ended. We just learned to be more careful about who we took." "You're not Cherokee," I said, finally understanding. "We're older than Cherokee," she replied. "Older than any tribe that came after us. We were the first people in these mountains, and we'll be the last." The leader spoke again, and this time I could hear the intelligence behind the alien words. These weren't monsters. They were people. A different kind of people, but people nonetheless. And they were talking about me like I was a problem that needed solving. Emma translated. "He says you've been a good guardian, keeping most of the loud ones away from our deep places. But now you know too much, and the harvest moon demands payment." They started closing in, spears raised, and I knew I was about to die. But then I remembered something Daniel Sequoia had said about the old wars between the Cherokee and the ancient enemies. "Fire," I said out loud. "You're afraid of fire." Emma's confident expression flickered. "Fire is dangerous in old forests," she said carefully. I pulled out my emergency flare and cracked it open. Red light blazed across the clearing, and every single pale figure stepped back. Not just stepped back, flinched away like the light caused physical pain. "The Cherokee knew," I said, backing toward the trail with the flare held high. "That's how they won the war." But I only had one flare, and it wouldn't last forever. I needed to get back to my cabin, to my radio, to some kind of help. The pale ones followed me through the forest, staying just outside the circle of red light, moving like wolves around a dying campfire. When the flare started to sputter, I cracked a second one, then a third. I had 6 in my emergency pack, but it was still 4 miles to my cabin, and they were getting bolder. That's when I heard the helicopter. Search and rescue, probably coming to check on my status since I'd missed my scheduled radio check-in. The sound of rotors echoed off the canyon walls, and suddenly spotlights were cutting through the forest canopy. The pale ones melted back into the shadows, but I could still feel them watching, waiting. The helicopter found a place to land near the falls, and 3 state police officers piled out with flashlights and weapons. They found me stumbling down the trail, half dead from exhaustion and fear, babbling about cave dwellers and ancient enemies. "Where's Ranger Sequoia?" one of them asked. "He was supposed to meet you." "Yesterday." I couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe it? "Bear attack," I said. "Big one. It got Joe, and it's still out there." They airlifted me out that night. By morning, there were 20 officers combing the forest, looking for Joe's body and the rogue bear that had supposedly killed him. They never found either one. The official report listed Joe Sequoia as missing, presumed dead due to wildlife encounter. The Morgan family was classified as victims of organized criminal activity, probably a group of survivalists or cult members living in the remote areas of the park. The case remained open, but inactive. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, officially being treated for exhaustion and minor injuries. Unofficially, I think they were trying to figure out if I'd suffered some kind of nervous breakdown. The psychiatrist assigned to my case kept asking about stress, about whether I'd been having problems at home, about my relationship with alcohol. I told him what he wanted to hear, that I'd been working too hard, spending too much time alone in the mountains, letting isolation get to me, that the bear attack on Joe had traumatized me more than I wanted to admit. He wrote me a prescription for sleeping pills and recommended a transfer to a less isolated station. But I didn't take the transfer. Instead, I went back to the mountains, because someone had to know. Someone had to keep watch. Daniel Sequoia was waiting for me at my cabin when I returned. He'd aged 10 years in the 3 weeks I'd been gone, and I could see in his eyes that he knew what had happened to his grandson. "The old war has started again," he said simply. I told him everything I'd seen and heard, about Emma Morgan and her changed family, about the cave behind the waterfall, about the leader who spoke in a language older than Cherokee. Daniel listened without interruption, then nodded like it all made perfect sense. "They've been taking people for years," he said, "not many at a time, and always carefully. A hiker who gets lost, a hunter who doesn't come home, easy to explain away. But now they're getting bolder. The harvest moon comes every year," Daniel said, "but some years it comes hungrier than others." He taught me the old protections, how to make proper fire barriers using Cherokee techniques, which herbs could be burned to create smoke that would drive them back, how to recognize the signs when they were scouting for new prey. Most importantly, he taught me how to keep them satisfied without feeding them innocent tourists. It's been 6 years now since the harvest moon of 1959. Every October, when the moon grows full and bright, I close certain trails for maintenance. I post warnings about dangerous wildlife in the areas closest to their deep places. I make sure camping permits are limited during peak hunting times. And sometimes, when the local police have a particularly dangerous criminal in custody, someone who has hurt children, someone who won't be missed, that person might escape during a prisoner transport near the mountains, might disappear into the deep forest, never to be seen again. The Pale Ones seem satisfied with this arrangement. They stay in their ancient territories, and I keep the innocent away from their hunting grounds. It's not a perfect solution, but it works. Emma Morgan visits sometimes, usually on nights when the moon is dark. She looks like a teenager now, still pale, still changed, but retaining enough of her old self to remember our connection. She brings me information about what her new family is planning, warns me when they're feeling restless or hungry. "You're our ranger," she told me once. "You protect the forest, and we protect you. What happened to your father? Your brother?" She smiled with those pointed teeth. "They're learning to hunt. Dad's getting good at it. Tommy was always better at hiding." I don't ask for details. The Cherokee Nation has quietly marked certain areas as sacred ground, off limits to tribal members during specific times of the year. They don't explain why to outsiders, but the elders understand. Some wars don't end with victory or defeat. Sometimes they just change form. I still get reports from other rangers, other states, missing hikers in West Virginia, strange attacks in Kentucky, unexplained disappearances throughout the Appalachian chain. The Pale Ones aren't limited to the Smoky Mountains. They never were. But here in my territory, we have an understanding. I keep the innocent away during hunting season. They keep their kills to those who deserve killing. It's not the job I signed up for 28 years ago, but it's the job these mountains need. And when I retire, If I live that long, I'll pass the knowledge on to whoever comes next, because someone has to stand watch. Someone has to remember that the old stories are true, and that some things are better left undisturbed. The harvest moon rises every October, bright and hungry and full of promises. I'll be ready for it. My name is Theodore Ashford, and I've been a ranger in Virginia's Jefferson National Forest for 14 years. People call me Ted. I'm 39 years old, divorced, and I have a teenage daughter named Sarah who means everything to me. Before this job, I was a military engineer. I know bridges, how to build them, fix them, and when they're about to fall down. I always believed the most dangerous thing about a bridge was bad construction or old age. Metal gets tired, stone cracks, wood rots. These are real problems you can see and fix. I never put much stock in the old stories the locals told about bridges having guardians or trolls demanding payment. That was just fairy tale stuff to keep kids from playing near dangerous water. I should have listened to those old stories. September 1976 was a wet month in the mountains. Heavy rains had been falling for weeks, turning creeks into rivers and making the back roads muddy and hard to drive. My area covers the Mount Rogers section, about 35 miles from the nearest real town. It's wild country up here, thick forests, deep valleys, and not many people. There's this old stone bridge way back in the mountains that crosses a gorge about 60 feet deep. The bridge has been there longer than anyone can remember. It's made of dark gray stone blocks fitted together so perfectly you can't slide a knife blade between them. No mortar that anyone can see. The thing is beautiful in an ancient way that makes you wonder who built it and how they got those massive stones up there without modern equipment. The locals call it different names: Stone Bridge, Old Bridge, Devil's Crossing. But the name that stuck was Bone Bridge, though nobody could tell me why. It's the only way across the gorge for 20 miles in either direction. Take it away, and people would have to drive 2 hours out of their way to get to town. I'd driven across that bridge hundreds of times in my 14 years as a ranger. Never gave it much thought. It was solid, well built, and showed no signs of stress or weakness. Perfect construction, really. Sometimes I'd stop and admire the stonework, wondering what kind of tools they used to cut blocks so precise. But something was different that September morning when I got the call from dispatch. "Ted, we got 2 vehicles abandoned at Stone Bridge," crackled the radio in my truck. "Owners are missing. State boys want you to take a look, see if there was an accident." I drove out there expecting to find broken glass, skid marks, maybe a drunk driver who wandered off into the woods. What I found instead made me stop my truck 50 feet from the bridge and just stare. 2 cars sat perfectly positioned at opposite ends of the bridge. Not crashed, not broken down, just parked, like someone had placed them there with a crane. The first car, a blue sedan, sat right at the edge where the road met the stone bridge. The second car, a red pickup truck, sat at the far end, also right at the bridge edge. Both vehicles had their doors closed, keys in the ignition, no signs of damage. I walked up to the blue sedan first and looked through the windows. A woman's purse sat on the passenger seat, open. Her wallet was gone, but everything else was there: makeup, tissues, a shopping list, loose change. The car was clean inside, no struggle, no blood. The red pickup told the same story: work gloves on the dashboard, a thermos of coffee still warm, a man's jacket folded neatly on the seat, but no wallet, no driver. I called it in. "Dispatch, this is Ashford. Something's not right here. Both vehicles look like the owners just stepped out for a minute, but they're nowhere around. No accident signs, no mechanical problems. Just missing people and missing wallets. Any tracks, Ted? I looked around. The recent rain had left the ground soft, perfect for footprints. But there weren't any. Not heading into the woods, not along the road, nowhere. It was like two people had just vanished into thin air, taking only their wallets. That's when I noticed something else. Both cars were positioned exactly the same distance from the bridge, maybe 3 feet from where the asphalt ended and the old stone began, like they had been measuring. I walked onto the bridge itself, looking for clues. The stone was dry despite all the rain we'd been having. Not just damp dry, but completely dry, like it had been covered. But there was no roof, no trees hanging over it, just open sky. Halfway across, I stopped and looked down into the gorge. The river below was running high from all the rain, rushing and foaming over the rocks 60 feet down. The sound should have been loud, but something was wrong with the acoustics. The water sounded different, deeper, like it was coming from much farther away. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. Dead silence. I walked back toward my truck, and the radio came to life again. Ted, you there? Yeah, I'm here. Radio cut out for a minute. I spent the rest of that day searching the area with 2 state troopers who drove out to help. We found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no signs anyone had ever been there except for those 2 perfectly positioned cars. But as we were getting ready to call it a day, one of the troopers made a discovery that changed everything. Hey Ted, come look at this. He was kneeling next to the bridge examining the stonework close up. See these dark spots in the rock? I knelt down beside him. What I had always assumed were natural variations in the stone color weren't natural at all. They were objects embedded in the mortar between blocks. Old objects. A tarnished coin. A piece of jewelry. Something that might have been a tooth. How long you figure this bridge has been here, Ted? I stood up and brushed the dirt off my knees. Long time. Before my time, that's for sure. But looking at those embedded objects, I was starting to think it might be longer than anyone imagined. And as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the bridge, I could have sworn I saw something move in the darkness beneath the stone arch. Something big. The next morning brought more missing persons. Ted, we got another one. Dispatch called at sunrise. Family of 4 didn't make it home last night. Last seen heading toward Stone Bridge around dinner time. I was already in my truck, coffee still hot in my thermos. 20 minutes later, I was staring at a scene that made my blood run cold. A station wagon sat at the bridge approach, positioned exactly like the other 2 vehicles, 3 feet from where the asphalt met stone. Doors closed, keys in ignition. But this time, there were signs of life interrupted. The back seat held 2 child car seats, both empty but with toys still scattered around them. A baby bottle sat in the cup holder, milk still fresh. On the front seat, a map was spread out with a route marked in red ink, leading home to a town 40 miles east. Jesus, I whispered, looking at those empty car seats. I called in every available officer in 3 counties. By noon, we had 20 people searching the woods around the bridge. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers, everyone looking for a family that had simply vanished. But it was Martha Caldwell who gave me the first real clue about what we were dealing with. Martha was the local historian, a thin woman in her 70s who knew every story and legend in these mountains. She drove out to the bridge in her old Buick and found me standing by the station wagon, trying to make sense of it all. Ted, "You need to know something about this bridge," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been researching it since the first cars showed up yesterday. This isn't the first time people have disappeared here." She handed me a thick folder full of old newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. 1962, traveling salesman found dead at bottom of gorge, wallet missing. 1954, young couple never made it home from a dance, car found at bridge. 1943, mail carrier disappeared, truck abandoned here. Goes back to the 1800s, Ted. Always the same pattern. I flipped through the papers. She was right. Page after page of missing persons, always at Stone Bridge, always with wallets gone and vehicles positioned exactly the same way. "There's something else," Martha said. "I talked to my grandmother before she died. She told me stories about this bridge that go back to when the Cherokee still lived here. They called it the stone that eats. Said there was something living under it that demanded payment from anyone who wanted to cross. Payment, tribute, gifts, sometimes." She paused, looking at those empty car seats. "Sometimes people." That afternoon, while the search continued, I decided to examine the bridge more carefully. Brought my toolkit and a measuring tape, thinking like an engineer instead of a cop. Maybe there were structural problems causing accidents that looked like disappearances. I started underneath, rappelling down into the gorge to check the foundation. What I found there made me question everything I knew about construction. The bridge wasn't built on bedrock like any sensible engineer would do. It was built on nothing. The supports just ended in midair, somehow holding up tons of stone with no visible foundation. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the bones. Hundreds of them, scattered on the rocks at the bottom of the gorge. Animal bones mostly. Deer, bear, smaller creatures. But mixed in were things that looked human. A rib cage, a skull with the top caved in. All old, bleached white by years of weather. I climbed back up and called Martha on my radio. "Martha, you said the Cherokee had stories about this place. What exactly did they say lived here?" "They called it the Stone Keeper. Said it was as old as the mountains, older maybe. It controlled the crossing, decided who could pass and who couldn't. The smart ones always brought gifts. Food, tools, precious things. The foolish ones tried to cross without paying. What happened to the foolish ones?" Static filled the radio for several long seconds. Then Martha's voice came back, quieter now. "They fed the stones, Ted. Made the bridge stronger." As evening approached, I sent the other searchers home. I wanted to spend the night at the bridge, see if I could figure out what was happening to these people. I parked my truck at a safe distance and settled in with a thermos of coffee and binoculars. For hours, nothing happened. Just the sound of rushing water from the gorge below and the wind through the trees. Then, around midnight, everything went quiet. The wind stopped. The water stopped. Even the insects stopped chirping. It was the deepest silence I'd ever heard, like the whole world was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. Something large moved in the shadow under the bridge arch. Not walked, moved. Like it was flowing from one place to another. The shadow was too big to be human, too fluid to be an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the bridge. The beam lit up the stone structure but cast no shadows. It was like the darkness under the arch was eating the light. Then the thing spoke. Not in words I could hear with my ears, but directly into my mind. A voice like grinding stone, ancient and patient and hungry. "Ranger, you have been watching. You have seen the toll." I tried to respond, but my voice wouldn't work. The thing continued. "This crossing is older than your roads, your cars, your people. It demands respect. It demands payment. Those who pay may pass. Those who refuse. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My coffee froze in the cup. Become part of the bridge. I saw it then, clearly, as it moved from shadow into moonlight. 8 feet tall, built like a man, but made of the same dark stone as the bridge. Its face was roughly carved, ancient, with eyes like deep caves and a mouth full of teeth that looked suspiciously like the bones I'd found in the gorge. It raised one massive arm and pointed at me. You understand now. Your people have forgotten the old ways. They take without giving. They cross without asking permission. This cannot continue. What do you want? I finally managed to whisper. Respect. Payment. The old compact honored. It stepped fully onto the bridge now, each footstep making the stone ring like a bell. Or I will teach them why the crossing was feared. Then it was gone. Not walked away. Just gone, like it had never been there. The temperature returned to normal. The sounds of the forest came back, but I could still feel it watching me from somewhere in the darkness. I didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, I found 4 more cars positioned perfectly at the bridge approaches. By the end of the week, 12 people had vanished at Stone Bridge. The state police wanted to close the bridge entirely, but the highway department said it would take months to build a detour. People needed to get to town for supplies, medical care, work. They couldn't drive 2 hours out of their way every time, so they stationed a patrol car at each end of the bridge, 24 hours a day. Officers were told to check every vehicle, make sure drivers had proper identification and valid reasons for crossing. It didn't help. The first patrol officer disappeared on Thursday night. Officer Jim Bradley, 15-year veteran, found at dawn sitting in his patrol car in perfect condition. Engine running, radio working, coffee still warm in his thermos. But Jim was gone, along with his wallet and badge. The second officer vanished Friday evening. Same story. Car undisturbed, personal items missing, no trace of struggle. That's when I realized the stonekeeper wasn't just taking random people. It was escalating, making a point. First travelers, then families, now law enforcement. It was showing us that our normal rules and protections meant nothing here. I called Martha Caldwell and asked her to meet me at the county library. We needed to research everything we could find about the bridge, the Cherokee legends, and anything else that might tell us what we were dealing with. The Cherokee stories are clearer than I first told you, Martha said, spreading old books and papers across a library table. The stonekeeper wasn't originally evil. It was a guardian, protecting an important crossing point between the physical world and something else. Something else? The spirit realm, the land of the dead. The Cherokee believed certain places were doorways, and doorways needed guardians to control who passed through. She showed me a hand-drawn map from the 1800s. This gorge was one of those places. The bridge was built to honor the guardian, to show respect. So what changed? White settlers. They didn't know the stories, didn't follow the traditions. They just saw a convenient bridge and started using it without paying proper tribute. Over time, the guardian got angry. She pulled out a journal from 1834, written by a missionary who had lived with the Cherokee. Listen to this. The Indians will not cross the stone bridge without first leaving an offering, food, tools, or precious objects placed in the gaps between the stones. When asked why, they speak of an ancient compact with the stonekeeper who guards the crossing. They say the white man's ignorance will bring terrible consequences. Consequences like people disappearing. Worse. Martha's hands shook as she turned the pages. According to the legends, if the tribute stops flowing, the stonekeeper has the right to collect what's owed, with interest. That night, I did something stupid. I went back to the bridge alone, carrying a bag full of offerings, food, tools, some old jewelry my ex-wife had left behind. I figured if the thing wanted tribute, I'd give it tribute. But when I got there, I found I wasn't alone. A school bus sat at the bridge approach, emergency lights flashing. 23 kids from the local elementary school, coming back from a field trip to a museum in the next county. Their normal route home took them right across Stone Bridge. Mrs. Henderson, the teacher, was standing next to the bus looking confused and scared. "Mr. Ashford, thank goodness. My bus won't start, and my radio's dead. The children are getting frightened." I looked at the bus. It was positioned exactly 3 feet from the bridge, just like all the other vehicles. The engine was running fine, but Mrs. Henderson couldn't seem to make it move forward. "How long have you been here?" "About 10 minutes. As soon as we stopped, everything went quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. And it's getting cold." She was right. The temperature was dropping fast, and frost was forming on the bus windows despite the September warmth. Through the glass, I could see 23 scared faces looking back at me. That's when the stonekeeper appeared. It rose up from the bridge itself, like the stones were reshaping themselves into its massive form. 8 feet tall, carved from the same dark rock, with those terrible cave-like eyes fixed on the bus full of children. "Ranger," its voice ground through my mind, "you brought offerings. Good, but the debt is larger now. Years of crossing without payment. Years of disrespect. The tribute must match the insult." "Take the offerings," I said, holding up my bag. "Take whatever you want, but let the children pass." Children. It considered this, tilting its massive stone head. Young ones learn respect better than old ones. Perhaps they should stay, learn the old ways, become part of the bridge. No. I stepped between the stonekeeper and the bus. "Take me instead. I'm the ranger here. It's my responsibility." The thing laughed, a sound like boulders crashing down a mountainside. "You cannot pay a debt of hundreds with the life of one." "But..." It paused, those terrible eyes studying me. "You have a daughter. She crosses this bridge twice a week, going to school in town. Very precious to you, yes?" My blood turned to ice. "Leave Sarah out of this." "All debts are paid, Ranger. One way or another. You have 3 days to decide. Tribute enough to satisfy years of insult, or I will collect what's owed from those you love most." The stonekeeper began to sink back into the bridge. As it disappeared, the bus engine coughed to life. Mrs. Henderson was able to drive across, taking the children to safety. But I knew this wasn't over. The thing had made its ultimatum clear. Pay up, or watch my daughter become part of its collection. I had 3 days to figure out how to kill something made of stone that had been alive since before my ancestors crossed the ocean. 3 days to save my daughter from a debt I didn't even know I owed. I spent the weekend researching everything I could find about the stonekeeper, the bridge, and the Cherokee traditions that had kept people safe for generations. Martha Caldwell helped, bringing me old books and stories she'd collected over the years. The answer, when I found it, was both simple and terrifying. The Cherokee didn't fight the stonekeeper, Martha explained as we sat in her kitchen Sunday night, surrounded by papers and books. They worked with it. The tribute wasn't punishment, it was partnership. They gave offerings, and the stonekeeper maintained the crossing, kept it safe and strong. So what happens if I just give it what it wants? That's the problem, Ted. After all these years of disrespect, of people taking without giving, the debt is too big for normal tribute. It wants a life, a meaningful life, someone connected to the bridge, responsible for it. Me, or someone you love. It's not cruel, Ted. just ancient. It thinks in terms of balance. Hundreds of crossings without payment, balanced by one significant life. Monday morning, Sarah called me from school. "Dad, I'm staying late for drama practice. Can you pick me up at 6? I'll be at the usual place on the other side of the bridge." The usual place. Stone Bridge was the only route between our house and her school. She'd been crossing it twice a day for 3 years, never knowing she was racking up debt with every trip. I had 6 hours to come up with a solution. I tried everything I could think of. Called the state police about closing the bridge permanently. They said it would take months to get approval. Called the highway department about building an emergency detour. They said it would cost millions and take years. I even tried to find another way to Sarah's school, but the detour was 40 miles through winding mountain roads that would take 2 hours each way. Not practical for daily school trips. As 5 o'clock approached, I loaded my truck with everything of value I owned. Tools, hunting rifles, my grandfather's watch, Sarah's college fund in cash, everything. If the stone keeper wanted tribute, I'd give it tribute like it had never seen. But I had a feeling it wouldn't be enough. I reached the bridge at 5:45. Sarah's drama practice ended at 6, and she'd be waiting for me on the other side. The stone keeper was already there, standing in the center of the bridge like it had been waiting all day. "Ranger, you have come to pay. I have tribute." I held up my bags. Everything I own. Tools, money, weapons, things people have valued for generations. Take it all, but let my daughter cross safely. The stone keeper examined my offerings without moving, somehow seeing into the bags without opening them. Generous, but insufficient. This bridge has stood for 1,000 years. Your people have crossed it thousands of times without payment. One man's possessions cannot balance such debt. Then what do you want? A life freely given, a guardian to replace the guardian, someone who understands the old compact and will enforce it. I felt the pieces clicking together in my mind. You want me to become like you, to stay here and collect tribute from crossers. Not become, replace. I have served long enough. I am tired, Ranger. I wish to rest. But the crossing must be guarded. The balance must be maintained. And if I refuse? Your daughter crosses at 6 o'clock. She will not reach the other side. I looked at my watch. 5:58. How do I know you'll keep your word? How do I know you'll let her live if I take your place? Because, Ranger, that is how the compact works. One guardian protects all who show proper respect. Your daughter will be safe, as will all who cross with humble hearts and appropriate offerings. 5:59. I could see headlights in the distance coming toward the bridge from the school side. Sarah, right on time. I accept, I said. But I want to see her cross safely first. I want to make sure she gets home. The stone keeper nodded. Stand aside, Ranger. Watch how a guardian protects those under his care. Sarah's car, an old sedan I'd bought her for her 16th birthday, approached the bridge cautiously. I knew she could see my truck and probably wondered why I was standing in the middle of the bridge with a stranger. She rolled down her window. Dad, is everything okay? Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just some bridge maintenance. You go ahead and cross. As her car moved onto the stone bridge, the stone keeper raised one massive arm. For a moment, I thought he was going back on our deal. Then I realized what he was doing. The bridge itself changed. The stones shifted and rearranged themselves, creating a perfectly smooth, safe passage. Every crack sealed, every weakness reinforced. The ancient structure became stronger and more stable than any modern bridge. Sarah drove across without even knowing her life had been in danger. She stopped on the other side and called back through her window. See you at home, Dad. I love you, sweetheart. Remember that. She drove away into the gathering darkness, safe and alive and free. The stonekeeper turned to me. You understand now. This is not punishment, Ranger. This is purpose. You will guard the crossing. You will decide who passes and who pays. You will keep the balance. For how long? Until another comes who understands the compact. Until someone else offers to take your place freely, out of love for those they protect. I felt the change beginning. My skin hardening, my thoughts slowing and deepening, but also expanding somehow. I could sense every animal in the forest, every drop of water in the river below, every traveler approaching on the mountain roads, and I could feel the rightness of it. This bridge was more than stone and mortar. It was a connection between worlds, a sacred trust. Someone had to guard it. Someone had to make sure the balance was maintained. The official report said I died in a bridge collapse while conducting a structural inspection. There was no body recovered, which wasn't unusual given the depth of the gorge and the speed of the river below. Sarah grieved for me, as daughters should grieve for fathers who die too young. But she never knew the real reason I disappeared, and I made sure she never would. The missing persons cases at Stone Bridge stopped completely. No more abandoned vehicles, no more mysterious disappearances. People started crossing safely again, though many reported strange dreams afterward. Dreams of leaving small offerings on the stone ledges, of showing respect to the ancient crossing. Martha Caldwell understood what had happened. She started quietly spreading the word among the locals about the old traditions. A few coins left on the bridge rail, a piece of food tucked between the stones. Small gestures of respect that kept the crossing safe for everyone. I remain here, as the stonekeeper did before me. I watch over the bridge and the people who cross it. I can feel their intentions, their hearts. Those who approach with respect and humility pass safely. Those who come with arrogance or disrespect learn differently. But I'm not a monster. I'm not cruel. I'm a guardian, protecting both the bridge and the people who need to use it. Most crossings require only a moment of acknowledgement, a brief recognition that this is a special place deserving of respect. Only occasionally does someone require more dramatic instruction. Sarah visits sometimes, though she doesn't know it's me. She stops at the bridge and leaves flowers on the rail, thinking of her father who died there. She's grown into a fine woman, graduated college, started her own family. Her children will cross this bridge someday, and they'll be safe because their grandfather guards the way. Other rangers work my old territory now. They've been told the bridge is stable and safe, which it is. What they haven't been told is why it stays that way. Late at night, when the mountains are quiet and the stars are bright, I sometimes see the old stonekeeper standing at the edge of the forest. He nods to me across the distance, one guardian acknowledging another. Then he fades back into the trees, finally free to rest after 1,000 years of service. The compact continues. The balance is maintained. The crossing remains safe for those who understand that some things in this world are bigger than themselves, older than their problems, and worthy of respect. And if you're ever driving through the Virginia mountains late at night, and you come to an old stone bridge crossing a deep gorge, remember this story. Stop for a moment. Leave a coin on the rail, or an apple, or just a quiet word of thanks. The guardian appreciates respect, and respect ensures safe passage. Trust me on this. I would know. My name is Jonathan Bramblewood, and I've been a forest ranger for 17 years. People think that's a boring job, just walking around trees all day, checking on campers, maybe fighting the odd wildfire. But let me tell you something. After what happened to me in the Cherokee National Forest back in June of 1963, I learned that plants can be a lot more dangerous than any fire. I was 43 then, married to Sarah, who's a botanist like me. We had 2 adopted kids, Tommy and Lisa, both about 10 years old. I used to be a college professor before I took this ranger job. Loved teaching, but I wanted to be out in the woods more, studying the plants up close instead of just talking about them in a classroom. The Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee was my home territory. I knew every trail, every creek, every type of tree and flower. My specialty was the health of the forest, making sure diseases weren't spreading, checking if pollution was hurting anything, that sort of thing. I'd published papers about Appalachian plant communities. Folks respected my work. There was one area I knew better than anywhere else, a place the locals called Laurel Hell. Sounds scary, right? It's just what mountain people called the thick patches of mountain laurel and rhododendron that grow so dense you can barely walk through them. The branches tangle together like a green maze. Some spots you have to crawl on your hands and knees to get through the tunnels the plants make. I always thought the name was just colorful mountain talk. The Cherokee folks had stories about these places, said there were plant people living in the deepest parts, spirits that could talk through the rustling of leaves. Old wives' tales, I figured. I was a scientist. I believed in facts, not fairy stories. Green men were just folk explanations for people who spent too much time in the woods, I used to tell my students. No such thing as plant spirits. Man, was I wrong. It started in early June, right after a weird late freeze that killed a bunch of vegetation. You don't usually get killing frost that late in the year, but 1963 was strange. The cold snap wiped out plants all over the forest. Leaves turned black, flowers died. Whole hillsides looked like they'd been burned. But here's the thing. Some areas in the Laurel Hell didn't seem affected at all. In fact, they looked greener and thicker than ever. That got my attention. As a scientist, I needed to understand why some plants survived when others died. I put together a small research team. Me, 2 graduate students from the university, and Dr. Mary Sequoia, a Cherokee woman who knew more about local plants than anybody. Mary was special. She understood both the scientific side and the traditional knowledge her people had kept alive for hundreds of years. "Jonathan," she said when I showed her the maps of the unaffected areas, "my grandmother always said those particular spots were protected." Protected by what? She just shook her head. Old stories. Probably nothing. But Mary looked worried, and she wasn't someone who worried over nothing. We planned to start our research on a Monday morning. The weather was perfect, sunny, warm, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. I felt good that day, excited even. I thought we might discover something new about plant biology, maybe figure out what made some vegetation tougher than others. I had no idea we were about to discover that some plants aren't just tough, they're awake. The first weird thing happened before we even got deep into the Laurel Hell. We were setting up our base camp at the edge of the thick growth when I noticed something odd about the trails. "Did you guys move any of these branches?" I asked the graduate students, Jim and Carol. They looked where I was pointing. There was a clear path through the laurel that I'd never seen before, and I knew this area like the back of my hand. "We haven't touched anything yet," Jim said. "Maybe other hikers cleared it?" "No hikers come through here," I said. "It's too thick. That's why we call it hell." Mary walked over and stared at the new path. Her face went pale. "This goes straight toward the heart of the protected area." "Protected by who?" Carol asked. "I thought this was all public forest." Mary didn't answer. She just kept staring at that path like it was a snake about to strike. We decided to follow it. The path was perfect, just wide enough for one person, with branches bent back in exactly the right way to let us walk upright. It was like someone had spent hours carefully arranging each twig and leaf. But who would do that? And why? As we walked deeper, I started noticing other strange things. The air felt different, thicker somehow, and quiet, too quiet. In a healthy forest, you hear birds, insects, small animals moving around. Here, nothing, just the sound of our footsteps on the soft ground. "Professor Bramblewood," Carol whispered, "look at this." She was pointing at a group of rhododendron bushes. They were arranged in a perfect circle, about 20 feet across. In the center, the ground was completely bare. No grass, no fallen leaves, nothing. Just smooth dirt. "That's unusual," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. In nature, plants don't grow in perfect geometric shapes. They spread randomly, following water and sunlight and soil conditions. Jim was taking photographs. "Maybe it's some kind of disease pattern," he suggested. "Sometimes fungal infections spread in circles." But when I looked closer, these plants weren't sick. They were the healthiest rhododendrons I'd ever seen. Thick green leaves, huge clusters of pink flowers. They just happened to be growing in a shape that shouldn't exist in nature. We set up our equipment and started taking samples. That's when things got really weird. Every time I tried to collect a leaf or piece of bark, my hands started tingling. Not like an allergic reaction. I knew what that felt like. This was different, like the plants were giving off some kind of electricity. "Anyone else feeling that?" I asked. Carol nodded. "My whole arm is buzzing." Mary backed away from the circle. "We shouldn't be here," she said. "It's just some kind of natural phenomenon," I told her. But honestly, I was starting to feel uneasy too. That's when we heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just wind in the leaves. But there was no wind. The air was completely still. And the sound was too regular, too much like human voices talking low. Jim lifted his head. "Do you guys hear that?" We all listened. The whispers were coming from the rhododendron circle, not from one plant, but from all of them, like a chorus of soft voices. I couldn't make out words, but it definitely sounded like language. "Okay," I said, "let's pack up and head back to base camp. We can analyze the samples there." But when I looked at the samples I'd collected, I got the shock of my life. The leaves I'd picked were changing. As I watched, they shifted from green to deep red, to purple to silver. The colors flowed through them like liquid. "That's impossible," Carol breathed. "I've studied plants my whole career. I know what plant cells look like under a microscope, how chlorophyll works, why leaves change color in fall. But this was like nothing in any textbook." Jim tried to take a photograph of the color-changing leaves, but his camera wouldn't work. Every picture came out black, like he'd forgotten to take the lens cap off. "Equipment failure," he muttered. "Must be the humidity." But it wasn't humid. It was a perfect dry day. That night, back at base camp, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those whispers. And I kept thinking about that perfect circle of plants, and the path that shouldn't exist, and the way the samples changed colors in my hands. Mary sat by the fire, not talking. Finally, I asked her, "What aren't you telling me about this place?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "My people have stories, old stories. about plants that think and feel and talk to each other, plants that remember everything that happens in the forest. Plants don't have brains, I said. They can't think. Can't they? Mary asked. How do you know? I didn't have an answer for that. The next morning, Carol didn't wake up. We found her lying in the same perfect circle we'd studied the day before, even though she'd been in her tent when we went to sleep. She was breathing, but she wouldn't respond when we called her name. Her eyes were open, staring up at the sky, and she was whispering in a language none of us recognized. The rhododendron branches around her had grown overnight. They formed a perfect spiral, with Carol at the center, like she was part of some kind of plant ceremony. That's when I realized we weren't just studying the forest anymore. The forest was studying us. We got Carol to the hospital in town, but she couldn't tell us what had happened. She remembered going to sleep in her tent and then waking up in the hospital. Everything in between was gone from her memory. The doctors said she was fine physically, but she kept drawing pictures of plants arranged in geometric patterns, perfect spirals and circles and triangles, over and over. I have to go back, she kept saying. They're waiting for me. The doctors thought she was having some kind of breakdown, but I knew better. Something in that forest had touched her mind. I called the university and told them to send a replacement researcher, but in the meantime, I had to keep working. The Forest Service was breathing down my neck about the research project, and there was pressure from higher up to figure out why that area was so different from the rest of the forest that had been damaged by the late freeze. Mary agreed to stay and help, even though I could see she was scared. My grandmother would never forgive me if I let you go in there alone, she said. The new graduate student, a young man named David, arrived 2 days later. He was eager to make a good impression, ready to dive right into the work. I didn't tell him about Carol or the whispers or the color-changing leaves. I figured he'd think I was crazy. We went back to the Laurel Hill that Thursday morning. The path was still there, but it had changed. Now there were 2 paths, the original one and a new one that branched off to the left. Both were perfectly maintained, like someone had spent all night clearing branches. Huh, David said. Local hiking club must be working on trail maintenance. I didn't bother to correct him. There was no hiking club. There were no other people out here. But I was beginning to suspect we weren't alone. We followed the new path this time. It led us deeper into the laurel hell than I'd ever been, to a place where the mountain laurel grew so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was green and dim, like being underwater, and that's where we saw them. At first, I thought they were just oddly shaped bushes, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was looking at human figures made entirely of plants. They were about the size of people, with arms and legs and heads, but instead of flesh and bone, they were woven together from vines and branches and leaves. Professor, David whispered, are those sculptures? The plant figures were standing in a circle around a massive oak tree that had to be hundreds of years old. As we watched, they began to move. Slowly, like they were dancing, they walked around the tree. Their vine arms swayed, their leafy heads turned toward us. One of them, the tallest one, maybe 8 feet high, stepped out of the circle and came toward us. Mary grabbed my arm. We need to leave, now. But I couldn't move. I was too fascinated and too terrified at the same time. The plant figure stopped about 10 feet away from us and raised what looked like a hand made of twisted branches. It pointed at me, then at the ground. It wants us to stay, I said. No, Mary said firmly. It's warning us to leave. That's when David did something incredibly stupid. He stepped forward and reached out to touch the plant figure. The moment his hand made contact with the vines, the creature exploded into motion. Its branches wrapped around David like ropes, lifting him off the ground. He screamed, but the sound was cut off as more vines covered his mouth. I lunged forward to help him, but Mary yanked me back. "Don't! You'll make it worse." The plant figure held David suspended in the air for maybe 30 seconds. Then it gently set him down and backed away. David collapsed to his knees, gasping and shaking. What was that thing?" he stammered. All around us, more plant figures were emerging from the thick vegetation. Dozens of them, all different sizes. Some were small, like children made of ferns and moss. Others were giants, 12 feet tall, with oak branches for bones and ivy for skin. They formed a circle around us, just like the rhododendrons had done. But they weren't threatening. Not exactly. They seemed curious, like they were studying us the same way we'd been trying to study them. The tallest one pointed at Mary and made a sound like wind through leaves. Mary said something back in Cherokee, her voice shaking. "What did you say?" I asked. "I told them we came in peace, that we mean no harm to the forest." The plant figure made another rustling sound. This time, somehow, I understood it. Not the words, there weren't any words, but the meaning came into my mind clear as anything. "You study us. Now we study you." That's when I realized these weren't just moving plants. They were intelligent. They had minds, thoughts, personalities, and they'd been watching us since the day we arrived. David was still shaking, but he managed to pull out his camera. The plant figures didn't try to stop him, but when he looked at the pictures later, they showed nothing but empty forest. Whatever these creatures were, they didn't show up on film. We stayed there for maybe an hour, surrounded by the plant beings. They didn't hurt us, but they didn't let us leave either. They just watched us with their leafy faces, occasionally making those rustling sounds to each other. Finally, the tallest one pointed toward the path we'd come from. The message was clear. Time to go. As we walked back toward base camp, David kept looking over his shoulder. "Those things," he said, "they were intelligent, weren't they? They were thinking." "Yeah," I said, "I think they were. But that's impossible. Plants don't have brains." Mary spoke up quietly. "Maybe they don't need brains the way we do. Maybe they think with their whole bodies." That night, I couldn't get the image out of my head. Dozens of plant creatures, all watching us with inhuman intelligence. What did they want? How long had they been here? And why were they showing themselves to us now? I was about to find out that showing themselves was just the beginning. The next morning, we discovered that our base camp had been completely surrounded by a wall of living branches. Not built, grown. Overnight, the trees had extended their limbs to form a perfect circle around our tents, about 20 feet high and thick as a prison wall. We were trapped, and from somewhere deep in the laurel hell, I could hear them calling to us in voices like rustling leaves, speaking words in a language older than human memory. They weren't just studying us anymore. They were deciding what to do with us. The wall of branches had one opening, a narrow gap just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. It led straight back into the heart of the laurel hell, toward the massive oak tree where we'd first seen the plant beings. "They want us to come to them," I said. David was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "This is insane. Plants can't grow that fast. Plants can't think. This is all impossible." But Mary was studying the wall with the eye of someone who understood both science and ancient wisdom. "Look at how the branches are woven together," she said. "This isn't random growth. This is architecture." She was right. Every branch, every twig was perfectly placed to create the strongest possible barrier. It would have taken human engineers weeks to plan something like this. The plants had done it in one night. "We have to go through," I said. "They're not going to let us leave until we do." David shook his head. "I'm not going back in there. Those things, they're not natural. They're dangerous. Everything in nature is dangerous if you don't understand it," I told him. But honestly, I was scared too. I just knew we didn't have a choice. Mary and I squeezed through the gap in the wall. After a moment, David followed us, cursing under his breath. The path led us straight to the ancient oak tree, but now the area around it had changed. The plant beings had arranged themselves in rows, like an audience in a theater. Hundreds of them, all different shapes and sizes, all watching us approach. In front of the oak tree stood the tallest figure, the one who seemed to be their leader. But now I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just vines and branches woven together randomly. The plant matter was organized like a human body, woody branches forming a skeleton, smaller vines acting like muscles, leaves clustered where organs might be. As we got closer, the creature began to change. Its leafy face became more detailed, more human-like. Not exactly human, still clearly made of plant matter, but recognizable as a face with eyes and a mouth. When it spoke, the words formed in my mind without passing through my ears. "We are the memory of this forest. We are the dreams of every tree, the thoughts of every flower. We have been here since before your kind walked upright." I tried to answer out loud, but it shook its head. "Think your words. We will understand." So I thought, what do you want from us? To understand you as you seek to understand us. Your kind threatens the forest. Soon, machines will come to cut down the laurel hell. A road will be built through our heart. I knew about the proposed highway extension. The state was planning to cut through a section of the forest to connect two towns. But that project wasn't supposed to start for months, and I hadn't told anyone in my research team about it. "How do you know about the road?" I thought. "We know all things that threaten the forest. The trees whisper to each other across vast distances. The flowers share their secrets with the wind. We are connected to every living thing in these mountains." Mary stepped forward. She spoke in Cherokee, and the plant being responded in the same language. After a few minutes of conversation, she turned to me. "It says the Cherokee people made an agreement with the plant people long ago. During the removal, when soldiers were forcing the tribes to leave, some of the plants helped hide Cherokee families in the deep forests. In return, the Cherokee promised to protect certain sacred groves. But your people are gone, the plant being continued, and the sacred places are no longer protected. Now the forest must protect itself." That's when I understood. These creatures weren't just curious about humans. They were preparing for war. The machines that come to cut the trees, I thought, what will you do to them? The plant being's leafy face shifted into what might have been a smile, if plants could smile. Around us, the other creatures began to rustle and move. Vines emerged from the ground, branches reached down from above, and flowers bloomed that I'd never seen before. Flowers with petals like sharp teeth and centers that glowed with an eerie green light. "We will defend ourselves." The message was clear. When the construction crews came to cut down the laurel hell, they would face an army of thinking, fighting plants. People were going to die. There has to be another way, I thought desperately. What if we could get the road moved? What if we could protect this area legally? You would do this, even though we are not your kind. Yes, but you have to promise not to hurt anyone. The plant being was quiet for a long time. Around us, the other creatures swayed and rustled, like they were having a conversation we couldn't hear. Finally, it reached out one branchy hand toward me. Touch us. Join with us. Become part of the forest's memory, and we will trust your words. I knew this was a test. If I refused, we'd probably never leave this place alive. If I accepted, I had no idea what would happen to me. I reached out and grasped the creature's hand. The moment we made contact, everything changed. I wasn't just Jonathan Bramblewood anymore. I was the forest. I could feel every tree, every flower, every blade of grass for miles around. I could sense the slow, deep thoughts of the oak trees, the quick, bright feelings of the wildflowers, the ancient, patient wisdom of the moss-covered rocks. And I could feel the fear. These plant beings weren't just protecting their territory. They were terrified. They'd watched forests being cut down all across the continent. They'd felt the pain of every tree that fell to human axes and saws. They knew that humans saw them as just things, resources to be used up and thrown away. But now they knew at least one human who understood what they really were. The connection only lasted a few seconds, but when it ended, I was changed forever. Looking down at my hands, I could see thin green lines under my skin. Not quite human anymore, but not fully plant either. You will speak for us, the plant being said, and we will trust in your promise. The wall around our camp was gone when we returned, dissolved back into ordinary trees as if it had never existed. But the changes in me were permanent. The green lines under my skin didn't fade, and I found I could sense the emotions of plants around me, their contentment in sunlight, their thirst during dry spells, their pain when they were damaged. David quit the research project that same day. "I'm going back to studying rocks," he said. "Rocks don't think." He never published anything about what he'd seen, and as far as I know, he never spoke of it again. Mary stayed to help me with the real work, not studying the plant beings, but protecting them. We spent the next 6 months documenting every rare and endangered species we could find in the proposed highway route. We mapped wetlands, identified critical habitats, and built a case for rerouting the road. It worked. The highway project was moved 5 miles south, and the Laurel Hill was designated as a critical ecological preserve. Officially, it was to protect rare plant species. Unofficially, it was to keep people away from something they wouldn't understand. 2 construction surveyors did die during the brief period when the original route was still being considered. They were found in the forest with no obvious injuries, but their bodies showed signs of some kind of toxic exposure that stumped the medical examiner. The official cause of death was listed as exposure to unknown plant alkaloids. I know what really killed them. They'd gotten too close to the plant being's territory before the deal was made. My wife Sarah joined me in developing new theories about plant intelligence and forest communication networks. Our research gained international attention, though we were careful never to reveal the full truth. Some secrets are too dangerous to share. My adopted children, Tommy and Lisa, grew up with an unusual ability to communicate with plants. They never found it strange. To them, it was just normal to feel what the garden was feeling, or to know when the houseplants were thirsty. I still visit the Laurel Hill regularly, maintaining my role as liaison between the human and plant worlds. The beings there have become my teachers. showing me how forests communicate across vast distances, how plants make decisions, how they remember events that happened decades ago. But the most important thing I learned is this: we're not alone on this planet. We share it with intelligences we've never recognized, consciousnesses that are older and in some ways wiser than our own. The Cherokee were right about the plant people. They've been here all along, watching us, judging us, deciding whether we can be trusted with the green world that sustains all life. Most of the time, I think the jury's still out on that question. If you ever find yourself deep in an old forest where the trees grow thick and the paths seem to change on their own, remember this: show respect, walk quietly, take only what you need, and leave no trace behind. Because they're watching. They're always watching. And if you listen carefully to the rustling of the leaves, you might just hear them whispering about you.